There are secrets so ancient that not even time has managed to erase them. Lost civilizations, impossible artifacts, languages no one can read, mysteries that remain alive, defying logic and feeding the imagination. The Ark of the Covenant. Among the veils of time and the pages of sacred texts, the silhouette of an object takes shape, an artifact that has captivated scholars and treasure hunters alike, one so loaded with symbolism, power, and mystery that its mere mention evokes images of celestial lightning, decimated armies, collapsed temples, and secrets sealed for centuries. The Ark of the Covenant, that golden chest described with pinpoint precision in the Book of Exodus, is not just a religious relic. It is also a permanent shadow in human history, a powerful absence that has fueled mythologies, conspiracies, legends, and impossible archaeology. It was said that the Ark held the tablets of the law given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, those stones inscribed with divine fire that marked the covenant between Yahweh and his people. But the Ark was more than a container. It was a symbol of the divine presence on earth, a tangible manifestation of absolute power, capable of causing miracles or catastrophes. Its structure, as described in Hebrew texts, was made of acacia wood covered in pure gold, with two facing cherubim on its lid, forming what was known as the mercy seat. From there, it was believed, God spoke to his people, between the wings of the two angels. The image could not be more powerful. The Ark not only guided the Hebrew people during their long journey through the desert, but also seemed to function as a sacred weapon. Stories show it bringing down walls, like those of Jericho, causing the defeat of enemies, and punishing those who dared to touch it without due reverence. On one occasion, a man named Uzzah, trying to steady it when it threatened to fall, died instantly, struck by an invisible fire. The idea that an object could contain such devastating energy has led many to wonder whether we are talking about advanced technology, spiritual energy, or something even more elusive. Over time, the Ark disappeared from biblical records as abruptly as it had appeared. Its last explicit mention occurs during the reign of Josiah, several centuries before Christ. After that, silence. There is no mention of its destruction, transfer, or theft. It simply stops being referenced. In a culture obsessed with recording and preserving the sacred, this omission is as deafening as any scream. And from that historical void, theories are born. One of the most persistent theories suggests that the Ark was hidden just before the Babylonian invasion of Jerusalem in the 6th century before Christ. Some believe that the temple priests secretly moved it to a safe location, possibly beneath the very Temple Mount, where even today, more than 2,000 years later, no one has been able to excavate due to the political and religious tensions surrounding that sacred hill. The possibility that it lies there, buried beneath the foundations of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the Dome of the Rock, has sparked passions as intense as conflict. Other versions point to Ethiopia, specifically the city of Aksum, where Ethiopian Orthodox monks assert, without hesitation, that the Ark rests inside a small chapel, guarded day and night by a single guardian, the only one allowed to see it. Ethiopian tradition, documented in the sacred text known as the Kebra Nagast, claims that the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba brought the Ark to his homeland as a divine legacy. For the faithful, there is no doubt. The true Ark is there, though no outsider has ever seen it or confirmed its existence. Even modern research attempts have been systematically blocked. The mystery remains intact, guarded by silence and faith. However, some believe the Ark did not travel so far. Certain independent researchers, relying on ancient maps and cryptic clues left in Templar manuscripts, claim the Ark was brought to Europe by members of secret orders such as the Knights Templar, who may have discovered it beneath Solomon's temple during the Crusades. These accounts, filled with romanticism and esoteric symbolism, fuel the idea that certain European bloodlines could have been linked to the Ark's power for centuries. Some even claim the Vatican holds secret documents about its location, or that the Ark is stored in a fortified chamber beyond the reach of the modern world. Beyond physical locations, some interpret the Ark's story from a metaphysical perspective. For some scholars of Jewish mysticism, the Ark represents a vessel of consciousness, a tool for channeling the divine spirit, whose disappearance reflects a stage in humanity's spiritual evolution. No longer is an external object needed to connect with the divine. The covenant now lies within each human being. This deeply symbolic view does not cancel the mystery, it transforms it, making it even more abstract and penetrating. Science, as expected, views these accounts with skepticism. To this day, there is no verifiable archaeological evidence of the Ark of the Covenant. Many consider the stories to be idealized, or even invented, meant to strengthen the cultural identity of the Hebrew people during years of exile and reconstruction. To these scholars, the Ark would be a symbolic creation, more powerful for what it represents than for anything it may have physically been. Still, even within academic circles, the discussion remains open. Some archaeologists point to ancient structures and underground tunnels in Jerusalem that may conceal sealed chambers. Others highlight the technical perfection of the Ark's description, suggesting that at the very least, a real model or reference once existed. The Ark's popularity has not diminished with time. In fact, its image has been amplified by popular culture, especially through film, with movies like Raiders of the Lost Ark, which not only brought its legend to modern audiences, but also reignited real-life expeditions. People from around the world have undertaken exhaustive searches in the deserts of Sinai, the ruins of Jerusalem, or the jungles of Ethiopia, chasing a relic whose mere possibility of existence seems to justify any risk. But perhaps the greatest mystery of the Ark of the Covenant is not its location, nor its power, nor even its composition. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect is the persistence of its presence in the collective imagination. Despite time, cultural shifts, and scientific advancement, the Ark continues to fascinate, inspire, and provoke profound questions about the sacred, the hidden, and the lost. In a way, it still fulfills its original function, being the center of an invisible covenant between humanity and the transcendent. And so the Ark remains, somewhere between history and legend, between earth and sky. It may lie buried beneath layers of ancient stone, or hidden in a remote temple, or perhaps exist only in the memory of a humanity unwilling to let go of its greatest mysteries. Because as long as unanswered questions exist, there will always be room for mystery to live. And in that space, the Ark of the Covenant will continue to shine with its golden light, eternal, untouchable, and perhaps more real than we imagined. The treasure of Oak Island, on the eastern coast of Canada, where the Atlantic Ocean waves crash with an ancient, melancholic constancy, lies a small tree-covered island, surrounded by perpetual mists and legends that cling to its roots as if they were part of the soil itself. Oak Island, a strip of land off the coast of Nova Scotia, has for more than 2 centuries been the stage for a near-mythical obsession, the search for a hidden treasure, buried beneath its layers of mud, stone, and time. Over the years, this island has swallowed fortunes, fueled hopes, ruined lives, and inspired theories ranging from the plausible to the absolutely fantastic. But the truth is that, regardless of what truly lies beneath its soil, Oak Island has become one of the most persistent enigmas of modern history. It all begins, like so many founding legends, with a simple story filled with promise. It was the year 1795 when a 16-year-old boy named Daniel McGinnis, while walking across the island, noticed something unusual: a circular depression in the ground, next to a broken branch hanging from an old oak tree. The scene felt theatrical, almost like a sign deliberately placed. Daniel returned with 2 friends, and driven by tales of corsairs and hidden loot, they began to dig. A few feet down, they found a layer of stones. Further below, every 3 meters, they encountered alternating layers of carefully arranged logs. This was not natural. Someone at some point in the past had dug there with a clear purpose, to hide something. As the years passed, what became known as the Money Pit turned into an abyss that continually devoured tools, hopes, and capital. Every expedition that attempted to exceed the original depth, already more than 20 meters, encountered the same thing. One trap after another, layers designed to frustrate progress, to confuse, to protect whatever rested in the depths. At 27 meters, a stone slab engraved with strange symbols was discovered. According to one of the most popular interpretations, it read, 40 feet below, 2 million pounds are buried. This simple phrase, as brief as it was explosive, ignited a fever that would never burn out. But Oak Island is no ordinary island. What sets this mystery apart from so many others is its consistency, the almost supernatural persistence of the obstacles that seem to arise with every new attempt. When early 19th century workers tried to dig beyond 30 meters, the pit flooded suddenly and completely, as if the sea had been absorbed by the earth with a sinister intelligence. It was later discovered that a series of drainage tunnels had been dug from the shore toward the pit, designed specifically to sabotage any attempt at access. Who would construct such an engineering feat, and for what purpose? What kind of treasure would require such a sophisticated defense system? Over the years, a long list of companies, adventurers, fortune hunters, and even prominent figures, including Franklin Delano Roosevelt, before he became president, were drawn by the promise buried in Oak Island. Millions were invested in excavation equipment, platforms, water pumps, detection systems, and state-of-the-art technology for each era. And although there were intriguing discoveries, pieces of parchment, chain fragments, carved stones, remnants of ancient wood, the ultimate reward always slipped away like a whisper in the fog. The closest anyone has come to a real discovery was in the 20th century, when what appeared to be an underground chamber was found, but collapsing ground and constant flooding prevented access. Theories about who might have built such a structure are as varied as they are extravagant. Some point to the Templars, who, after being persecuted in Europe, may have crossed the Atlantic with their most sacred treasures, including the Holy Grail or relics from the Temple of Solomon, to bury them far from the grasp of kings and popes. Others speak of Caribbean pirates, particularly the legendary Captain Kidd, who may have needed a hiding place for his vast loot. Still others suggest the Masons, the Rosicrucians, the Vikings, Spanish explorers, or even the Phoenicians. Each culture has supposedly left behind clues, signs, symbols that fuel new interpretations. One of the most unsettling aspects of the mystery is the so-called Curse of Oak Island, a legend that claims 7 people must die before the treasure is found. To date, 6 people have lost their lives in various incidents related to the excavations: collapses, explosions, accidents. This number, so close to the supposed prophecy, has helped to surround the island with an aura of tragic destiny, as if it were protected not only by ancient engineering, but also by a force that transcends logic. Today, thanks to the momentum of the television series documenting the most recent excavations, the mystery has reached a new generation. Technology has advanced, tools are more precise, geological analyses more thorough, but the result remains the same: clues, possibilities, suspicions, but never the final revelation. It is as if the island offers small crumbs of truth to keep the flame alive, but never fully surrenders. The Lagina brothers, currently leading the project, have discovered objects that date from before the official discovery of America, which opens a new line of questioning about possible visitors to the island in distant centuries. But beyond the gold, beyond the relics or the monetary value of what might lie beneath the island, what has truly captured the collective imagination is the mystery itself. The notion that something so complex, so ancient, and so carefully hidden could exist in our world, defying modern technology and eluding understanding for more than 200 years, awakens an ancestral fascination. In a time when everything seems within reach, when satellites can scan entire continents and databases endlessly accumulate knowledge, Oak Island remains a frontier of the unknown, a reminder that there are still places where secrets resist, where the earth refuses to speak. Such is Oak Island, a small, quiet island, covered with trees and moss, but with a heart that beats with the echo of ancient voices and lost maps. A place where the past is not buried, but crouched, waiting. Perhaps someday someone will manage to crack the final code, bypass the traps, resist the curse. Or perhaps the true treasure is precisely this, the promise, the enigma, the eternal possibility. The Lost Tomb of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. The story of Cleopatra and Mark Antony is, without exaggeration, one of the greatest tragic tales in human history. Not because of the romanticism that centuries of literature, theater, and film have insisted on emphasizing, but because of the historical moment they represented, the collapse of a millennia-old civilization and the end of an era. Their deaths marked the final twilight of pharaonic Egypt, the consolidation of Rome as an absolute empire, and the quiet retreat of a queen who had embodied the spirit of a nation. However, what truly makes Cleopatra's story retain such a powerful shadow of mystery, even more than 2,000 years later, is not only her life, but the great enigma that surrounds her after death, the complete disappearance of her tomb. Ancient accounts agree that Cleopatra and Mark Antony, after their defeat at the Battle of Actium against the forces of Octavian, who would later become Emperor Augustus, returned to Egypt knowing their fate was sealed. Mark Antony, mistakenly believing his beloved had died, took his own life. When Cleopatra discovered his body, she had it brought to her private funerary chamber, already prepared for eternal rest. Shortly after, she herself, according to the most widespread versions, committed suicide using snake venom, perhaps from an asp, although some sources suggest toxic ointments or other methods. What stands out is that chronicles from the time, such as those written by Plutarch and Dio Cassius, mention that both were buried together in a majestic tomb, built by the queen's own command somewhere near Alexandria. And here begins the true mystery. Because although history has preserved many aspects of her life in detail, her childhood in the court of the Ptolemies, her relationship with Julius Caesar, her mastery of political art, her alliance with Mark Antony, the place where their remains rest has been completely lost, as if the Egyptian earth had chosen to absorb the last breath of its sovereigns to shield them from the gaze of the modern world. Alexandria, the city that was the capital of her kingdom, has undergone enormous transformations over the centuries. Earthquakes, tsunamis, invasions, fires, and the passage of time have altered its geography to the point of making it unrecognizable. Large sections of the ancient city are now submerged beneath the Mediterranean Sea. The temples, palaces, and monuments that once lined the Nile Delta and shone like jewels of the ancient world are now covered by layers of sediment and salt water. The exact site of Cleopatra's royal palace, for example, was not confidently identified until the late 20th century, when teams of underwater archaeologists managed to locate sunken structures off the modern coast of Alexandria. From that moment on, the search intensified, but the tomb remained elusive, as if it refused to be found. For centuries, many have searched for it in vain. Some believed it was hidden in a secret crypt within the palace itself, now underwater. Others, however, argued that Cleopatra chose a more sacred, more symbolic place for her eternal rest. It was this second theory that led Dominican archaeologist Kathleen Martinez, in the early years of the 21st century, to turn her attention to a site previously little considered, the Temple of Taposiris Magna, located about 40 kilometers west of Alexandria. Built during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus and dedicated to the god Osiris, this temple possessed a series of symbolic and architectural features that, according to Martinez, made it the ideal place to house the tomb of a queen who, in her final days, would have wished to connect not only with the pharaonic lineage, but also with the resurrection myths of Osiris and the eternal rebirth of Isis, a figure with whom Cleopatra deeply identified. Since then, excavations at Disappearance Magna have yielded truly significant discoveries. Statues, coins bearing Cleopatra's face, inscriptions, passageways, underground chambers. Several high-status mummies have even been found buried in richly decorated sarcophagi, indicating that the temple was used as a necropolis. But the main chamber, the royal tomb, the final crypt of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, has still not been found. Martinez argues that the design of the temple and its funerary symbolism align with a clear intent: to preserve the queen's soul within a religious context in which death was not the end, but the gateway to a sacred transformation. The discovery of underground tunnels at surprising depths, some carved by hand, suggests the existence of a funerary complex yet to be revealed, perhaps deliberately hidden or sealed after the death of its occupants to prevent desecration. At this point, archaeology merges with intuition, with a kind of spiritual calling that has led researchers from around the world to continue digging in search of that tomb that seems to defy time. However, there is an opposing line of thought, which claims that the tomb will never be found because it was destroyed long before it could be rediscovered. Some historians argue that, after the Roman conquest, Octavian may have ordered the dismantling of anything that glorified the figure of Cleopatra, in order to erase her political and cultural legacy. This would include the tomb, statues, documents, and even her representations in temples. According to this view, the disappearance of the tomb was not an accident, but a deliberate act of historical censorship, a form of symbolic victory over a woman who dared to challenge Rome. What is fascinating is that, even without a body, without a mausoleum, without an inscription confirming its location, Cleopatra has not vanished from the collective imagination. Her figure endures, not as a shadow of the past, but as an active presence in the present. The search for her tomb is not merely a matter of archaeological curiosity. It is also an act of historical justice, a way to return her voice and her place in the memory of the world. Because oblivion is the definitive death, and Cleopatra has not yet been forgotten. As technology advances and more sophisticated methods are applied, such as ground-penetrating radar scanning and geochemical subsoil analysis, hope grows that perhaps in the near future, that sealed chamber will be discovered, intact since the 1st century before our era, where the remains of Cleopatra and Mark Antony lie together, just as they dreamed, embraced for eternity. In the meantime, the mystery remains, suspended like a whisper between the desert sands and the waters of the Mediterranean. And perhaps it is precisely that mystery that keeps the story alive, that transforms a lost tomb into a powerful symbol, into a question that crosses generations, into an echo that still resonates in the broken stones of Disappearance Magna, and in every corner where history mingles with legend. The Antikythera Mechanism. Sometimes the past drops a piece into the present as if tossing a stone into the waters of time, creating ripples that alter everything we thought we knew. That is what happened in the year 1901, when a group of Greek divers, while exploring the remains of a shipwreck near the small island of Antikythera in the Aegean Sea, recovered what at first seemed like a simple lump of bronze corroded by salt water and the passage of centuries. Among statues, amphorae, and the remains of a Roman ship, that fragmented object appeared, covered in calcified incrustations, with no hint of its true value. What no one knew at the time, not even the archaeologists who stored it away without much attention, was that the deformed piece of metal contained one of the most baffling secrets of antiquity. A machine that should not have existed in that era. A jewel of engineering that seemed to come from an impossible future. Several years had to pass before anyone realized that, beneath the layer of salt and rust, there were gears. Precise gears, carved with a delicacy no other known object from that time had ever displayed. It was like finding a Swiss watch in a Mycenaean tomb. The confusion was immediate, and as studies progressed, the disbelief only grew. What became known as the Antikythera Mechanism was not a simple ornament or a technical curiosity. It was an analog computer built in ancient Greece, at least a century before the birth of Christ, designed to predict astronomical positions, eclipses, planetary cycles, and calendar events with such millimetric accuracy that even today, experts approach it with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. The machine, in its fragmentary state, did not give up its secrets easily. It was necessary to use advanced imaging techniques, such as X-ray computed tomography and structured light photography, to penetrate the corroded layers and mentally reconstruct its components. What emerged was a complex network of more than 30 interconnected gears, rotating axles, hidden inscriptions, and calibrated scales used to carry out astronomical operations of unexpected sophistication. It was discovered that the mechanism could reproduce the movements of the Sun, the Moon, and, according to more recent analyses, the 5 planets known to the Greeks: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Through a series of knobs and dials, the user could observe the sky of the past or anticipate that of the future. Nothing in the known technological tradition of the ancient world comes close to this achievement. The precision required to carve such small gears, with teeth so finely calculated, suggests mastery of extremely advanced engineering, in addition to the mathematical knowledge needed to understand the complex astronomical cycles these gears represented. For a long time, it was believed that such a level of technical development would not appear until more than 1,000 years later, with the astronomical clocks of medieval Europe. The Antikythera Mechanism disrupted that timeline, forcing historians to reconsider what humanity was capable of imagining in periods much earlier than previously admitted. The exact origin of the mechanism remains a mystery. It is suspected that it was built in some Greek workshop, perhaps in Rhodes, or on the island of Antikythera itself, but its authorship remains in the shadows. Some have suggested it might have been designed by Hipparchus of Nicaea, one of the most important astronomers of antiquity, whose theories about lunar movements are reflected in the way the mechanism calculates lunar anomaly. Others link it to Archimedes, the genius from Syracuse, although his death in the year 212 before Christ places his life too far back in relation to the estimated date of the shipwreck. There is also the possibility that the mechanism was the product of a school of thought and design now lost, a lineage of wisdom that, for reasons beyond our understanding, was swept away by history. What is known is that the ship carrying the mechanism appeared to be a luxury vessel, loaded with treasures likely headed toward Rome. Many bronze and marble statues, some of them Greek, were found among the wreckage. It is possible that the device was part of a private collection intended for a Roman aristocrat, or even for a temple. Its presence on that ship reinforces the idea that the objects on board were of great value, both artistic and scientific, and that the mechanism was not an isolated artifact, but the reflection of a knowledge that, for a brief moment in history, reached an unprecedented level of sophistication. And yet, no traces remain of similar mechanisms. No ancient source describes the existence of a device like this in detail. Neither the texts of Hero of Alexandria, nor the works of Vitruvius, nor Roman technical treatises offer us a real parallel. This absence has led some to theorize that the Antikythera Mechanism was a unique piece, the result of an exceptional mind, or that others like it existed but were destroyed, melted down to reuse their materials, or simply ignored by generations that did not understand their function. Over the years, the machine has been interpreted through many lenses. For some, it represents the peak of ancient Greek knowledge, proof that science in that era was far more advanced than our modern biases allow us to admit. For others, it is an anomaly, a historical accident, as if the future had briefly visited the past before vanishing. There are also those who, more inclined toward the esoteric, see in the mechanism evidence of lost knowledge passed down by civilizations predating recorded history, or even by non-human sources. Although these latter theories do not withstand scientific scrutiny, they speak to the deep fascination the object provokes. What is truly unsettling about the Antikythera mechanism is that, when one observes it, one does not simply see an ancient device, but an open window into a civilization that understood the harmony of the cosmos and knew how to translate it into pieces of metal. It is an invitation to reevaluate the lines we draw between the ancient and the modern, between the rudimentary and the complex, because the mechanism does not fit into the linear narrative of progress. It is a reminder that knowledge can emerge, shine brightly, and disappear, leaving only a trace behind, waiting centuries to be understood again. Today, fragmented but patiently and technologically reconstructed, the mechanism rests in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, where it continues to captivate those who stop in front of it with eyes wide open and minds willing. Around it unfolds not only a technical story, but a deep, almost spiritual sensation of standing before something that should not exist, but does. A machine that, in its centuries of silence, still holds secrets we are only beginning to glimpse. And while its parts continue to be scanned, its inscriptions translated, and its origins debated, the Antikythera mechanism continues to resist being reduced to a simple category. It is not merely an astronomical tool. It is an enigma, a mechanical echo from a time that slips through our fingers. The lost city of Helike. In the vast constellation of civilizations that once shone and then vanished within the Mediterranean basin, few hold an aura of tragedy, mystery, and oblivion as powerful as Helike, a city that was once a cultural jewel of ancient Greece, and that, in a single night, sank beneath earth and water, leaving behind a void so profound that, for more than 2,000 years, many even doubted it had ever existed. And yet, the ancients spoke of it as one speaks of a warning, as an admonition engraved in history. Helike was located in the region of Achaia, on the northern coast of the Peloponnese, facing the Gulf of Corinth. During the 5th century before the birth of Christ, it was a prosperous, influential city, deeply respected by the rest of the Hellenic world. It stood out not only for its wealth and its role as a political center within the Achaean League, but also for its devotion to the god Poseidon, whom they worshipped as their absolute patron. Its temple to the god of the sea was one of the most important in all of Greece, and his image was reproduced on the city's coins, a symbol of its status and divine connection. Ancient texts describe it with admiration. Philosophers like Heraclides and writers such as Strabo, Pausanias, and Aelius Aristides mentioned it as an example of lost splendor. Even Homer himself, centuries before its destruction, already sang of Helike in his verses, which indicates its longevity and prestige. But what is most fascinating about this case is that its end was so abrupt, so complete, and so strange, that for centuries it was attributed mythical qualities, similar to those of Atlantis. The tragedy occurred in the winter of the year 373 before the birth of Christ. One night, without prior warning, the earth shook with such violence that it split the fields, opened cracks through which the sea surged, and shook even the firmest foundations. A devastating earthquake, followed by a tsunami, wiped out the entire city and sank it into the depths of the ground, which collapsed as if it had yielded to an invisible weight. The waters of the Gulf flooded the valley and sealed it, engulfing all its inhabitants, temples, markets, homes, and monuments. By dawn, Helike was gone. In its place, there remained only a muddy lagoon, a heavy silence, and a salty scent that permeated the tragedy. The event left such a deep impression on the Greek memory that it became a common reference for centuries. Travelers said that, on calm days, one could see the remains of the columns from Poseidon's temple beneath the water like a petrified message at the bottom. the area remained deserted for generations, turned into a taboo space, and the story of Helike began to blur between historical chronicle and mythological warning. For centuries, no one knew for sure where it had been located. The region was slowly repopulated, and although the legend of the lost city persisted in manuscripts and tales, its exact location became an enigma. Some believed it had never existed, that it was a literary invention inspired by Atlantis. Others thought it lay beneath the sea, beyond the shoreline, unreachable by any archaeological effort. As if the ancient world had wished to leave that memory submerged, untouchable, safe from time and modern desecration. It was necessary to wait until the end of the 20th century for the waters to begin receding, at least symbolically. In the 1980s, a Greek archaeologist named Dora Katsonopoulou, in collaboration with physicist Spiridon Marinatos and engineer Helios Yiannopoulos, decided to approach the problem from a different angle. Instead of searching underwater, they began to examine the nearby coastal plains, starting from the idea that, over the centuries, the shoreline could have changed dramatically. What was once underwater could have ended up inland due to sedimentation and geological shifts. It was a bold intuition, but it made sense. Excavations began near the village of Rizomylos, in the region of Aigio, and soon started to reveal structures that matched the profile of an ancient city. Paved streets, cyclopean walls, decorated pottery, votive figurines, broken columns, and most revealing of all, coins bearing the symbol of Poseidon. Each discovery reinforced the possibility that they had found what the world believed lost forever. And although debates still persist about whether the remains belong to Helike's main urban center or its outskirts, the general consensus is that the city lies there, hidden beneath layers of silt and gravel, waiting to be rescued from oblivion. One of the most intriguing aspects of this discovery is the state of preservation. Because the city was buried suddenly, without a process of abandonment or looting, many of the structures and artifacts have remained intact, as if time itself had frozen that fateful night. Archaeologists have compared this phenomenon to that of Pompeii in Italy, where the eruption of Mount Vesuvius sealed the city in ash, preserving a perfect portrait of Roman daily life. In Helike, it was mud and water that achieved the same, but with Greek memory. Some researchers have suggested that the disaster of Helike may have influenced Plato's narratives about Atlantis. Although Plato's story is older, it is likely that tales such as Helike's were used as examples of nature's destructive power and divine punishment against human arrogance. For Helike was not just any city. Its wealth, its religious pride, its cultural influence were causes for admiration, but also, perhaps, for caution. When a city places itself too close to the gods, it risks being treated as one. Today, archaeological work continues, with multidisciplinary teams combining geophysical technology, satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and carbon dating. Each year, new fragments of the city are discovered. Canals, rooms, lesser temples. Every stone removed is a line recovered from a story thought erased. The lost city is slowly beginning to speak again, though it does so in whispers. The story of Helike reminds us that entire worlds may exist beneath our feet, waiting to be unearthed. That the earth, though silent, is a library where each layer of soil holds a page written in the handwriting of time. And that cities, no matter how grand or powerful they believe themselves to be, are not invulnerable. In the tremor of an instant, everything can vanish. But also, centuries later, it can re-emerge with the poetic force of what should never have been forgotten. Helike, the city swallowed by the sea, is no longer just a legend. It exists once more, and its resurgence is a reminder that mystery, when respected and patiently sought, can transform into revelation. The Anunnaki Gods. In the vast and ancient plain of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, one of the earliest known civilizations of humanity flourished. There, among cities of baked brick, ziggurats that rose toward the heavens, and tablets inscribed with mysterious writing, a pantheon of deities was born that, over time, would become the origin of one of the most intriguing and debated theories in the world of mystery. The enigmatic story of the Anunnaki, those ancient gods who, according to some, were not symbolic deities, but real entities with a purpose far different from worship. The Anunnaki, as they are presented in Sumerian inscriptions, were the great gods of the heavens, descendants of An, the god of the sky, and Ki, the goddess of the earth. Their presence spans thousands of years of Mesopotamian mythology, appearing in Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian records, adapting to each culture while preserving their essence as powerful figures, hierarchically organized, with specific functions and extraordinarily human behaviors. They were beings of great wisdom and power who intervened in worldly affairs, influenced harvests, appointed kings, and punished disobedience. For centuries, scholars of ancient history interpreted the Anunnaki within the religious and symbolic framework of the cultures that venerated them. However, in the second half of the 20th century, an alternative current emerged that forcefully stirred the debate by reinterpreting these figures not as mere products of mythological imagination, but as visitors from another world. It was the writer Zecharia Sitchin who popularized this hypothesis through his work, The 12th Planet, in which he claimed that the Anunnaki were actually extraterrestrial beings from a distant planet called Nibiru, whose elliptical orbit would bring them close to Earth every several thousand years. According to Sitchin's interpretation, these beings descended to Earth over 400,000 years ago, with the goal of extracting gold and minerals needed to repair the atmosphere of their home world. Faced with the difficulty of extracting these resources themselves, they would have created human beings through genetic engineering, mixing their own DNA with that of primitive hominids. Thus, humanity, in this alternative vision, did not emerge through natural evolution nor divine intervention, but as a hybrid race designed for labor, whose progressive awakening would have led to the myths of rebellion, knowledge, and the separation between gods and men. It is a theory that, though rejected by the scientific and academic community for lacking methodological rigor and being based on erroneous translations or forced interpretations of ancient texts, has deeply resonated in popular imagination. The allure of the Anunnaki lies not only in what they supposedly did, but in what they represent. The possibility that our roots are not solely terrestrial, but part of a cosmic encounter, a forgotten legacy that continues to pulse in our genes like a dormant signal waiting to be awakened. Beyond exotic theories, the cuneiform texts found on thousands of archaeological tablets speak of the Anunnaki with impressive complexity. In the Atrahasis poem, for example, it is told how the lesser gods, exhausted by the labor of maintaining the world, rebelled against the greater gods. As a solution, the Anunnaki created humans so that they would serve as workers and relieve the divine burden. This story, surprisingly close to the version defended by ancient astronaut theorists, has been interpreted both mythologically and literally, depending on the reader's perspective. What is fascinating is that the Mesopotamian stories echo across other cultures. The idea of gods descending from the sky, teaching humanity, bringing forbidden knowledge, or manipulating men appears in narratives as diverse as the legends of the Andean Viracochas, the Egyptian creator gods, or even the Elohim of the Hebrew Genesis. These parallels, though not necessarily indicative of a hidden truth, do suggest a universal pattern of thought, a shared intuition that humanity's deepest knowledge was, at some point, an external gift, not an internal discovery. From an archaeological perspective, the remains of the Sumerian civilization are so ancient that they continue to astonish. Among the first to invent writing, organize city-states, calculate astronomical positions with extraordinary precision, and erect monuments on a monumental scale, the Sumerians seem to have experienced a sudden flourishing of knowledge. Astronomical tablets like the Enuma Anu Enlil, star maps, and lunar calendars anticipate discoveries that, in some cases, would be rediscovered centuries later in other civilizations. But the heart of the Anunnaki mystery lies not so much in technical data as in the tone of the stories. The gods do not appear as distant and invisible entities, but as physical figures with bodies, emotions, passions, and decisions. They interact with humans, guide them, punish them, fall in love, conspire among themselves. In some texts, like the famous Enigma of Tartessos, the creation of the world occurs amidst a war between deities, and man is born from the blood of a fallen god. This level of physicality and drama has led many to suggest that, more than spiritual deities, the Anunnaki were memories of tangible beings distorted by time, whose memory was transformed into myth. However, it is also possible to interpret all this mythology as a human projection. The gods reflect who we are, our hierarchical organization, our contradictions, our longing to understand the cosmic order through recognizable figures. In that sense, the Anunnaki are a mirror, one that reflects our own image, but tinted with the sacred, the ancient, and the unreachable. Their story, far from being an anomaly, is part of a human tradition of attributing to the heavens the answers we do not find on Earth. Today, interest in the Anunnaki has expanded beyond the academic realm. Documentaries, popular science books, video games, series, and novels have turned these ancient gods into protagonists of a new contemporary myth. They are the expression of a deep desire, the desire not to be alone, the hope that there is a connection between the cosmos and our existence, that we are not a biological accident, but part of a greater, mysterious, perhaps unfinished project. And that is where the mystery persists, not in the scientific evidence, nor in the tablets unearthed by generations of archaeologists, but in the interpretation we give to what we have inherited. Because the Anunnaki, whether gods, mythological figures, or projections of a past distorted by time, have achieved what few ancient entities have managed: to remain alive. They continue to inspire questions, provoke debate, and ignite the imagination. They continue to challenge the boundary between the real and the symbolic. Perhaps we will never know for sure who the Anunnaki were. Perhaps they are what they have always been: the trace of a thought ahead of its time, a spark of the inexplicable that crossed the centuries. But as long as that spark exists, as long as we keep wondering about them, the Anunnaki will not have disappeared. They will continue to dwell there, in the shadows of the temples of Ur, in the lines carved into clay, and in that deep corner of human consciousness that still looks to the sky in search of answers. The disappearance of Nefertiti. For centuries, the name of Nefertiti lay dormant in the sands of Egypt, forgotten by the dynasties that followed her, erased from official records, as if her memory had been deliberately silenced. And yet, when in 1912 archaeologists discovered her iconic bust at Tel El Amarna, this limestone masterpiece with its elongated neck, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to gaze beyond time, her image immediately became synonymous with elegance, enigma, and a kind of beauty that goes far beyond the aesthetic. But that immortal face holds one of the great mysteries of ancient Egypt: the ultimate fate of Nefertiti, the great royal wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten, who disappeared from historical records at the height of her public life, as if she had been torn from history with an intent we still do not fully understand. During the second half of the 14th century before the birth of Christ, Egypt experienced a spiritual earthquake. Akhenaten, pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, broke with millennia of polytheistic tradition to establish the exclusive worship of Aten, the solar disk, and founded a new capital, Akhetaten, now known as Amarna. It was a profound revolution, both in religious, artistic, and political terms. And at his side, reigning with power, visibility, and influence like no other queen before her, was Nefertiti. Inscriptions from the time show her participating in religious ceremonies, presiding over offerings, receiving foreign tributes, even wielding the scepter with her own authority. Her name appears next to the pharaohs on numerous monuments, and there are scenes where she is depicted striking enemies, a gesture reserved solely for kings. All this indicates that her status was exceptional and that her role was not limited to that of consort. Nefertiti was a political, religious, and cultural figure of the highest order, inseparable from Akhenaten's project. However, around the 12th year of the pharaoh's reign, something happened. Her name began to vanish from inscriptions. Reliefs replaced her with anonymous figures or other lesser wives of the king. Her mention disappeared from the boundary stele of Amarna. Traces of her presence faded as quickly as she had burst onto the stage of absolute power. The question that has haunted generations of Egyptologists ever since is, what happened to Nefertiti? The hypotheses are as varied as they are fascinating. The first possibility, perhaps the most straightforward, is that she died suddenly, the victim of illness or complications during childbirth. However, her disappearance was not accompanied by a traditional funeral ceremony, nor by the usual construction of tombs for someone of her rank. In a civilization obsessed with death and with recording every ritual detail, the absence of records surrounding her death is, at the very least, suspicious. Another theory, even more puzzling, suggests that Nefertiti did not disappear, but rather adopted a new identity. Some scholars propose that after Akhenaten's death, she assumed the throne under the name Neferuaten, ruling Egypt for a short time before the rise of Tutankhamun. This hypothesis is based on certain ambiguous inscriptions that mention a female pharaoh who ruled during the final years of the Amarna heresy, and who used epithets and formulas very similar to those previously used by Nefertiti. If this is true, then we are speaking of a woman who not only ruled alongside her husband, but succeeded him as absolute sovereign, something extremely rare in pharaonic history. However, this theory faces problems. The name Neferuaten also belongs to one of Nefertiti's daughters, which complicates the identification. Moreover, the scarce documentation from that period, marked by the collapse of the Atenist regime and the restoration of the old gods' worship, makes any assertion more an interpretation than a certainty. And above all, the disturbing fact remains that Nefertiti's body, her tomb, her funerary artifacts, have yet to appear. No archaeological discovery has confirmed her ultimate fate. Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves stirred great interest by proposing that Nefertiti's tomb might be hidden behind a sealed wall in Tutankhamun's tomb. He based his argument on radar studies conducted in the burial chamber of the young pharaoh, where he believed he identified straight lines that could indicate hidden passages. According to his hypothesis, Tutankhamun's tomb was originally intended for Nefertiti, and the boy king was buried there as a last-minute solution after his premature death. Although the radar findings were controversial, and the Egyptian authorities did not allow more invasive exploration, the idea still lingers as a possibility that refuses to be entirely dismissed. What makes Nefertiti's disappearance so fascinating is not only the enigma of her tomb, but the context in which it occurred. She was the most influential female figure of the most radical period in Egyptian history, and her sudden erasure from the record appears to reflect a systematic effort to erase all trace of the Atenist regime. After Akhenaten's death, the country plunged into a deep religious and political crisis. The capital was abandoned, the temples of Aten destroyed, and the worship of Amun restored with force. In that process, many figures from the previous reign were condemned to oblivion. Images of Akhenaten were destroyed, his statues mutilated, his name removed, and with him, so was Nefertiti's. This damnatio memoriae, that deliberate act of historical erasure, could explain why we do not know where she is buried. If her body was hidden, relocated, or even destroyed by zealots of the new regime, it is possible we may never find physical proof of her existence beyond the bust that immortalized her. But there is also a subtler possibility that she herself chose silence as refuge. If in her final years she realized that her legacy was in danger, she may have ordered her tomb to be sealed in a discreet place, with no evident markings, far from the center of power, protected from future vandalism. Perhaps that decision made her the most sought-after queen in history. In any case, the figure of Nefertiti has achieved what few historical characters have managed: to survive time, censorship, and oblivion. Her image, rescued from the dust by archaeologists, has become a universal symbol of beauty and mystery. Her story, or her lack of story, continues to challenge those who believe that everything has already been discovered, that the past has already been clearly told. Nefertiti, the Solar Queen, still lingers in the shadows of the desert, among the cracked walls of Amarna, in the erased inscriptions, in the nameless sarcophagi, and in the hidden chambers that may never open. Her silence, more than an absence, is an ancient voice that continues to resonate in every excavation, in every debate, in every attempt to decipher history. And as long as we do not find her tomb, as long as her face continues to gaze at us from the marble without speaking a word, the mystery will keep beating. Because there are secrets that are not revealed with tools or theories, but that remain as necessary enigmas, guardians of wonder. And Nefertiti, the woman who ruled beside the sun, is one of them. The Oracle of Delphi. In the very heart of ancient Greece's spiritual core, at the foot of Mount Parnassus, and wrapped in a landscape that seemed suspended between heaven and earth, there existed a place where the gods spoke, where destinies were revealed in whispers carried by vapor, and where the most powerful figures of the ancient world bowed before a mysterious female figure, the Pythia, priestess of Apollo and voice of the Oracle of Delphi. That sanctuary was not merely a temple, but a crossroads between the human and the divine, an invisible threshold where the words of the gods filtered through the body of a woman in a trance. What is fascinating is that all of this, far from being a fable lost among mythologies, was documented, respected, and feared for more than 1,000 years. The story of the Oracle of Delphi stretches across centuries, woven into the folds of time and the expansion of the Hellenic world. Delphi was considered the navel of the world, the point where all the forces of the earth converged, marked by Zeus himself when he sent 2 eagles from the ends of the universe, which met precisely there. Upon that sacred spot rose the Temple of Apollo, surrounded by white columns and mysteries no less solid. It was a place charged with an energy difficult to define, where kings, generals, and humble citizens arrived in hopes of obtaining answers, certainties, a glimpse of what the future held. The figure of the Pythia, the name given to the priestess responsible for channeling Apollo's words, has sparked ongoing fascination, not only because of the enigmatic nature of her role, but also due to the extraordinary state she entered during consultations. According to ancient accounts, such as those by Plutarch, who was himself a priest at the temple, the Pythia entered a trance, seated on a tripod, placed above a fissure in the temple floor, from which vapors emerged that induced her into an altered state of consciousness. From there, amid a sometimes incomprehensible language, she uttered phrases that were then interpreted by the priests to make sense of the god's message. Many of the greatest moments in ancient history passed through that room. Strategic decisions in wars, the founding of new colonies, the laws of entire cities were influenced by what was spoken within those sacred walls. The oracle's fame was such that its predictions crossed the borders of the Hellenic world and reached Persian kings, Egyptian leaders, and Roman figures. And although many of its answers were ambiguous, laden with symbolism that allowed for multiple interpretations, its power lay precisely in that ambiguity. They were seeds of interpretation that took root in the decisions of men. For centuries, philosophers attempted to understand the true nature of the oracle. Some believed the Pythia to be a pure channel of the divine, a temporary vessel of a sacred force that passed through her and left her empty after the trance. Others thought the phenomenon had a more natural explanation, a kind of spiritual exaltation induced by the conditions of the place, the isolation, the ritual preparation, and perhaps substances inhaled without scientific knowledge. The truth is that the phenomenon of Delphi was not a marginal or isolated event, but the very heart of the spirituality of an entire civilization. Modern archaeology has tried to shed light on this phenomenon from a different perspective, searching in geology for what the ancients attributed to the power of the gods. In the 1980s, a team of researchers led by geologist Gel de Boer and archaeologist John Hale conducted a detailed study of the land where the Temple of Apollo stands. What they discovered was as surprising as it was revealing. The temple was built precisely at the intersection of two active geological faults, the Delphi Fault and the Kurna Fault. This configuration produced gas emissions from the subsoil, especially ethylene, a hydrocarbon that, when inhaled in small doses, can induce a state of euphoria, hallucination, and loss of motor control. This theory, supported by chemical studies conducted on the temple ruins, offered a possible explanation for the Pythia's trance state, without stripping the phenomenon of its extraordinary character. In fact, it reinforced it by showing that the ancients, without modern knowledge of geology or chemistry, deliberately built a spiritual center over an active fissure that altered human perception. It was no coincidence. It was knowledge, perhaps empirical knowledge, passed down through generations, but knowledge nonetheless. A wisdom that united the body, the earth, and the cosmos in a shared experience. But even with this explanation, the mystery does not disappear. What happened in Delphi for more than 1,000 years was not merely the result of an inhaled gas, but a complex cultural phenomenon, a carefully orchestrated ceremony that brought together ritual, architecture, politics, emotion, and faith. Consultations with the oracle were marked by the sacred calendar, by ritual preparations, by costly offerings. The Pythia herself was chosen from among the town's women, trained in the cult of Apollo, removed from public life, and devoted to the temple as a mediator between mortals and the eternal. The oracle operated until the 4th century of our era, when Christianity, already established as the official religion of the Roman Empire, closed the ancient pagan temples. Thus ended, in silence, one of the longest-lasting spiritual institutions in history. The temple was abandoned, the statues removed, the columns toppled by time and earthquakes. But the echo of its responses still resonates, because the desire to know the future, to understand destiny, is a force that does not disappear with religions or eras. The Oracle of Delphi, at its core, was not a place for obtaining concrete answers. It was a ritual mirror where seekers saw reflected their doubts, their fears, their hopes. It was a liminal space where words were born between the sacred and the human, and where what mattered was not so much what was said as what was understood. In that sense, the oracle still lives on in every inner search, in every moment when a human being faces the unknown and tries to decipher it, to shape it, to find guidance amid the chaos. Delphi was not merely a stone structure. It was a living intersection between science and myth, between the earth and vision. Today, when one walks among the ruins of its former splendor, one does not simply observe archaeological remains, but the invisible trace of a time when the gods spoke and humanity listened. The elongated skulls of Paracas. On the Paracas Peninsula, in the south of Peru, where the desert meets the ocean in a harsh and silent line, the wind drags centuries of history across a dry, almost Martian land. There, in that nearly barren yet deeply symbolic landscape, human remains were discovered that have continued to provoke questions, controversy, and theories since the moment they were unearthed. We refer to the elongated skulls of Paracas, a set of skeletal remains that defy the common proportions of human anatomy, and that, when exhumed, seem to scream from their very shape that something in our past has not been fully understood. The discovery took place in the 1920s, when Peruvian archaeologist Julio C. Tello, considered the father of modern archaeology in his country, found an underground necropolis composed of hundreds of burial tombs, many of which contained extraordinarily well-preserved mummies. The Paracas culture, which flourished approximately between the 7th and 3rd centuries before the birth of Christ, was a complex society, deeply spiritual and artistically prodigious, recognized for its exquisite textiles, detailed goldwork, and advanced knowledge of medical practices such as cranial trepanation. However, what caught the world's attention was the shape of the skulls that began to emerge from those tombs. Some displayed such extreme elongation that it seemed to challenge the normal structure of the human skull. These were not small deformities or spontaneous malformations, but a deep, symmetrical, deliberate transformation. Faced with these findings, theories began to multiply. Was it a ritual practice? A genetic mutation? Evidence of contact with civilizations beyond our planet? The most widely accepted explanation by traditional anthropology is that these elongated skulls are the result of a technique known as artificial cranial deformation, a practice that consisted of modifying the shape of the skull from infancy, when the bones are still malleable, using boards, bandages, or pressure devices placed on the newborn's head. This custom, recorded in multiple cultures around the world, from the Huns of Central Asia to certain African tribes, served, according to studies, as a symbol of status, belonging, or beauty. In the case of Paracas, elongation was a mark of identity that distinguished elites, spiritual leaders, or certain privileged castes. However, the Paracas skulls present particularities that have made more than one researcher doubt. The cranial capacity of some specimens is between 25 and 30% greater than that of an average human skull. In addition, the bone structure of several of these remains does not show clear signs of the type of external pressure that usually leaves visible marks in artificial deformation. The parietal suture, which divides the two hemispheres of the skull at the top, appears to be absent in some cases, which has been interpreted by certain sectors as possible evidence of a different morphology, non-human, or at least not entirely human. It is here that the mystery intensifies. Although the scientific community insists that these anomalies can be explained by uncommon cranial development processes, isolated genetic alterations, or errors in interpretation, others have seen in these differences the possible trace of a larger story, a story that perhaps official archaeology has chosen not to explore in depth. Ancient astronaut theorists have used the Paracas skulls as one of the key pieces of evidence to support the hypothesis that advanced civilizations, or even beings of extraterrestrial origin, may have had contact with pre-Columbian cultures, leaving genetic traces in their descendants or imposing symbolic practices to imitate their appearance. This latter idea, although controversial and dismissed by the majority of academics, has generated a wave of independent investigations. Some laboratories, under private initiative, have carried out genetic analyses on samples taken from these skulls. In certain cases, preliminary results yielded mitochondrial DNA sequences that did not easily correspond with known indigenous populations, which has further fueled speculation. However, the lack of transparency in methods, absence of institutional oversight, and limitations in access to the samples make these results questionable, at least from a rigorous scientific standpoint. Even so, fascination remains. Because beyond whether these skulls belong to beings different from us or not, the truth is that they express a profound cultural will, an almost obsessive intention to modify the body to reach an ideal, a symbol, a form of transcendence. The elongated head, rising toward the sky, departing from anatomical norms, may have been understood as a sign of closeness to the gods, a way to mark spiritual power in the very matter of the body. And that, in itself, reveals a level of symbolic sophistication that deserves to be contemplated with awe. The iconography of other Andean cultures also seems to reflect this preference for the elongated head. In ceramics, textiles, and sculptural representations, figures appear with skulls extended backwards, with slanted foreheads and upright necks, suggesting that cranial deformation was not an isolated whim, but part of a deeply rooted value system. The body was a canvas for the sacred, and its physical transformation, a form of spiritual inscription. The Paracas culture disappeared gradually, absorbed by the rise of new regional powers such as the Nazca Civilization. But their funerary practices, their complex relationship with death, and their obsession with the vertical, with the elevated, continue to speak from the sands of the desert. The elongated skulls, with their empty gaze and challenging shape, have become a sort of modern symbol of the unexplained, a door open to interpretation, speculation, and mystery. Today, many of these skulls are preserved in local museums, where they can be observed with the same mixture of astonishment and bewilderment they likely provoked in those who first unearthed them. They are there, silent, as witnesses to a humanity that does not entirely match our own, as reminders that history does not always fit within the boundaries we like to draw. And although scientific consensus insists on placing them within an understandable cultural logic, they continue to raise questions that brush against the forbidden, the ancestral, the elusive. Perhaps we will never know with absolute certainty why cranial deformation was practiced in Paracas, nor whether there was something more behind those elongated bones than a ritual custom. But what we can affirm is that their presence has managed to transcend time, the desert, and the pages of books, and has taken its place in the privileged space of human imagination. Because there are forms that speak to us from deep within, that seem to tell of a different world, of a vision of the body, the soul, and the cosmos that we have not yet fully understood. And as long as those skulls continue to exist, whether exposed or buried, as long as they keep questioning us with their improbable silhouette, the mystery will remain alive, pulsing like an ancient voice that refuses to be silenced completely. The Labyrinth of Crete. Among the deepest roots of Western mythology, at the uncertain boundary between history and legend, lies a structure that, although not physically preserved in its entirety, has left such a powerful mark on the collective imagination that its existence continues to fuel debates, theories, and archaeological obsessions. The Labyrinth of Crete, that place where, according to the ancient Greeks, the Minotaur lived, a hybrid creature, condemned to darkness and fed with human sacrifices. But beyond the myth, what has kept this story alive is the possibility that the labyrinth was not only a metaphor, but a real structure, an architectural work that, with its tangled corridors and deliberately confusing design, existed in the physical world, perhaps as a symbol of power, control, or mystery itself. The myth, in its most well-known form, tells that King Minos of Crete, after receiving a divine gift from the god Poseidon, a majestic white bull, disobeyed the divine will by keeping the animal instead of sacrificing it. As punishment, his wife Pasiphae was enchanted to fall in love with the bull, and from this unnatural union, the Minotaur was born, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull. Unable to kill it but aware of its monstrosity, Minos commissioned the architect Daedalus to build a labyrinth so complex that no one could escape once inside. In that dark place, the Minotaur lived isolated from the world, fed with youth sent as tribute by Athens. The story continues with the arrival of the hero Theseus, Ariadne's thread, and the defeat of the monster. But what truly remains as a haunting shadow in this narrative is the idea of the labyrinth itself. For centuries, the question has been whether that structure, with its intricate corridors, was not simply a poetic invention, but a work inspired by a real construction, so impressive in its design that it sparked the need to give it a mythological explanation. And here archaeology enters the scene, with the 20th century discovery of the Palace of Knossos on the island of Crete by the British archaeologist Arthur Evans. What he found beneath layers of earth and ruins was not just any building, but a palace complex with multiple levels, interior courtyards, intersecting corridors, staircases without an obvious pattern, and interconnected rooms arranged so unintuitively that, even with modern blueprints, it is difficult to navigate. Evans, deeply influenced by Greek mythology, quickly associated this find with the Labyrinth of Minos. He named the Cretan civilization Minoan in honor of the legendary king, and proposed that the palace was not only an administrative center or royal residence, but also the architectural origin of the labyrinth myth. The spatial confusion generated by Knossos' design, its planned complexity, its almost organic layout, reinforced the idea that the building was conceived to disorient, to impress, to create the sensation of being inside something larger than what the senses could comprehend. The frescoes found on the palace walls, depicting bulls and ritual acrobatics known as tarokatapsias, strengthened the connection to the Minotaur myth. The bull figure held a central symbolic weight in Minoan culture, and it is not hard to imagine how, over time, a ritual narrative linked to these practices could have transformed into a story about monsters, punishments, and heroic redemptions. The bull, as a sacred animal associated with fertility, power, and sacrifice, became the symbolic axis of a mythology that centuries later the Greeks would reinterpret through the lens of their own worldview. However, not all experts agree with the identification of the Palace of Knossos with the mythical labyrinth. Some argue that the structure, as complex as it is, does not meet the architectural requirements of a true labyrinth. There is no evidence of dead ends or passageways deliberately designed to confuse the visitor. From this perspective, what Evans interpreted as a labyrinth could have simply been a densely built citadel, adapted to the climatic and social needs of the time. The obsession with finding the labyrinth may have clouded archaeological objectivity. Other researchers have explored the possibility that the real labyrinth was located elsewhere, perhaps in the underground quarries of Gortina or in the caves of Messara, natural or artificial spaces that, due to their own geological configuration, offered a feeling of loss and confinement. These theories, although less well known, hold that the myth could have arisen from real experiences of exploration or punishment, where human beings were taken to these subterranean spaces without possibility of orientation, generating over time a cultural memory transmitted as myth. What is fascinating about the Labyrinth of Crete is that, beyond its physical existence, it has endured as a symbol on multiple levels. It is the space of trial, challenge, the descent into one's inner self. In many philosophical and psychological traditions, the labyrinth represents the inner journey of the hero, the confrontation with one's own monsters, the path lost only to be found again. It is a mental, spiritual, and cultural structure as much as a physical one. In that sense, the legend has far surpassed the need for archaeological confirmation. Today, the remains of the Palace of Knossos stretch beneath the Cretan sun, partly restored, enthusiastically interpreted, and also skeptically viewed. Tourists walk through its corridors, trying to imagine what life was like there, while experts debate the degree of idealization Arthur Evans imposed on his reconstructions. But what no one can deny is that there is something deeply hypnotic about that site, an energy hard to define that seems to come from below the surface, as if the myth still lives among the stones. The Labyrinth of Crete perhaps never existed exactly as the ancients told it. Maybe it was a fable built upon real structures, exaggerated over time and embellished by imagination. Or perhaps it existed in another form, more subtle, more symbolic, in the architecture of power, in the ritual of the sacred, in the complexity of a civilization that still guards secrets. What is certain is that, as long as it continues to be talked about, as long as its story inspires books, research, and debates, the labyrinth will not be lost. It will keep beating, underground or in the mind, as an open challenge, as an unsolved enigma. The identity of Homer. In the history of humanity, there are names that become pillars, voices that cross centuries, not because of the power they held in life, but because of the lasting impact of their words, the immense echo of their work. And among those names, few are as legendary as that of Homer, the supposed author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, two poems that not only shaped the soul of Greece, but also molded, with their verses, the epic imagination of all the West. Yet, the more deeply one tries to know the man behind these immortal songs, the clearer it becomes that we face one of the oldest, most complex, and most debated enigmas in literature. Who was Homer really? For more than 2,000 years, scholars, philologists, philosophers, and historians have tried to put a face and biography to a name that, although omnipresent, seems to inhabit a foggy terrain between the historical and the mythical. Tradition presents him as a blind poet, born in Ionia, possibly in the city of Smyrna or on the island of Chios, who would have lived sometime between the 9th and 8th centuries before the birth of Christ. He is attributed a wandering life, devoted to reciting epics by memory as part of an ancient oral tradition. But each of these details, far from being certain, has been questioned, reinterpreted, or directly denied by entire generations of researchers. One of the great problems surrounding the figure of Homer is the total absence of documentary or archaeological evidence contemporary to his supposed existence. There are no portraits, no personal descriptions, no signed manuscripts. Everything known about him comes from much later sources, some written centuries after his supposed lifetime, which has led to the idea that Homer might not have been a single person, but a collective name, a symbol under which multiple voices, multiple poets, belonging to an oral tradition were grouped and eventually fixed in writing over time. This hypothesis, known as the Homeric question, has given rise to countless theories. Some maintain that the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed by different people at different times, and that the stylistic, thematic, and structural differences between the two works prove different authors. Others argue that both epics were reworkings of much older oral materials, passed down from generation to generation by the Hades, the professional singers of ancient Greece, and that Homer was the final compiler or editor, the one who managed to give a definitive form to a body of legends that already existed in the Greek collective imagination. Literary analysis techniques from antiquity to today have tried to identify the hands behind the text, the styles, formulas, repetitions, and variations that could indicate multiple authors. Homeric verses are full of fixed epithets, repetitive formulas, and metric structures indicating a composition designed for oral recitation rather than silent reading. All of this has led to the thought that the poems, as we know them, might have been written long after the time they were conceived, possibly during the Archaic period, when the Greek alphabetic writing began to establish itself and made it possible to transcribe long compositions. And yet, there is something deeper at play. Because beyond their concrete authorship, what intrigues is the type of knowledge, sensitivity, and worldview those poems contain. The Iliad, with its almost brutal precision in describing war, with its clear-eyed look at pride, fate, and death. The Odyssey, with its endless journey, its quest for home, its encounters with the strange and monstrous. Both works are not simply epic tales. They are meditations on the human condition, wrapped in the poetic grandeur of a language that has been admired for millennia. The philosophical depth of these texts has led some scholars to wonder whether Homer was, in fact, a solitary genius who synthesized an entire worldview, or rather the symbolic face of a collective tradition, of a cultural memory that needed a central figure to survive through time. From Plato to Nietzsche, passing through Alexander Pope, Milman Parry, or Friedrich August Wolff, the debate has continued without ever reaching a definitive resolution. Some have even suggested that Homer could have been a woman, or that behind the name were entire families of rhapsodes who operated as a school of oral transmission. In this sense, Homer would be more a title than a name, a cultural function rather than a physical person. This view, although speculative, aligns with other forms of cultural production in the ancient world, where individual authorship did not carry the same weight as it does today, and where works were considered products of lineage, legacy, and an inspiration that transcended the individual. In the 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann's archaeological discoveries in Turkey, at the site identified as ancient Troy, rekindled interest in the historical background of the Iliad. Although his methods were questionable and his enthusiasm bordered on fanaticism, the truth is that Schliemann showed that behind the poetry, there could be a real substrate, a war, a conflict, a city that existed. This reinforced the idea that Homer, whoever he was, did not write from pure invention, but from a historical memory that still vibrated in the songs of his people. Today, genetic studies, linguistic analyses, and digital reconstructions of the Mycenaean world continue searching for clues about who Homer was, if he lived, where, and under what conditions a mind capable of constructing such monumental works could have arisen without leaving any trace other than his verses. But perhaps that very absence is part of his power. The figure of Homer remains a fertile void, a silhouette guessed but not confirmed, an echo repeated without a visible source. And so the enigma continues. Because Homer is not just an author without a face, he is an open question, a crack in literary history that refuses to close. And as long as his poems continue to be read, performed, reinterpreted, he will continue to exist, not as a certainty, but as a possibility. A voice without a body, a mind without a biography, a mystery that reminds us that the origin of great stories is often not in the signature at the end of the page, but in the invisible fire that ignites the words. The City of Ubar, at the southernmost tip of the Arabian Peninsula, beyond the rolling dunes of the Rub al-Khali Desert, where the sand stretches like a dry ocean without shores, there is a name that echoes from the pages of the Quran, the whispers of caravans, and the obsessions of modern explorers. A name that represents both a lost city and a divine warning, both a symbol of power and of downfall. That name is Ubar, the city of pillars, mentioned in the sacred surahs of Islam as Iram, the city cursed for its arrogance, buried by celestial punishment. For centuries, it was thought to be a legend, a fable born from oral tradition. But in the last years of the 20th century, something changed. The earliest mentions of Ubar appear, like many ancient legends, in stories passed down by merchants, pilgrims, and Bedouin poets. It was described as a fabulous metropolis located in the heart of Arabia, rising between columns so tall they touched the sky, rich in goods and power, but also in pride. It was said to be a center of trade for incense, myrrh, and spices, whose products traveled from the southern mountains to the ports of the Mediterranean. According to Islamic tradition, its inhabitants disobeyed God's commands and were therefore punished with a storm that wiped them off the map. The city sank into the earth, swallowed by the desert. From that moment on, Ubar became a shadow of the past, a ghost city floating in time without a precise location. For centuries, the Western world largely ignored this legend. But at the beginning of the 20th century, with the rise of archaeological exploration and growing fascination with lost cities, the name Ubar began to acquire special allure. Some started calling it the Atlantis of the Sands. It was, like that mythical sunken city, a symbol of power destroyed by excess, a reminder that civilization, however advanced, can disappear in an instant if it defies natural or divine laws. The definitive change occurred in the 1990s, when a group of researchers, led by Nicholas Clapp, a filmmaker, amateur archaeologist, and scholar of Arab history, decided to pursue the search for Ubar from an innovative perspective. Using satellite images obtained from NASA, they began to trace ancient caravan routes across the Rub al-Khali Desert, searching for patterns in the sands, traces invisible to the human eye, but recorded by orbital technology. Against all odds, they discovered convergences of ancient roads heading toward a specific point in the desert, an isolated place called Shisar in present-day Oman. Subsequent excavations revealed architectural remains that astonished archaeologists. Stone structures, ruined towers, deep water wells, and signs of ancient urban activity came to light. Even more, beneath one of these structures, the researchers found a huge underground cavity caused by the collapse of a natural cavern, which may have dragged part of the city into the abyss. The geology of the site matched the Quranic account, a city disappearing underground as punishment. The evidence, although fragmentary, was enough for the finding to be tentatively considered the location of the mythical Ubar. However, as with every great mystery, certainties fade with time. Some archaeologists and scholars have questioned identifying the Shisar site as the mythical Ubar. For them, the remains discovered are not those of a city, but rather of a caravan fortress, a checkpoint on the incense route, likely inhabited for centuries, but without the grandeur attributed to Iram in religious sources. The poetic exaggeration, the passage of centuries, and the mixing of mythology and historical record would have transformed a modest trading station into a legendary city, magnified by nostalgia for the past. And yet, the site remains a source of questions and fascination. The structures found at Shisar reveal greater complexity than expected, and artifacts uncovered in excavations suggest interaction with distant cultures, indicating that, at least at some point, a vibrant commercial hub existed there, connected with wider networks of the ancient world. Fragments of pottery, metal tools, and remains of warehouses indicate that something important was happening at that location, and that oral memory did not arise from nothing. Beyond archaeology, what keeps Ubar alive in interest is the symbolic power its story holds. The city that sinks, the civilization that self-destructs out of pride, is a universal narrative. It appears in Babel, in Sodom, in Atlantis, in all those warnings cultures have repeated to themselves about the dangers of forgetting limits. Ubar is, in that sense, a mirror in which each generation looks at itself with unease. Furthermore, the Rub al-Khali Desert, the empty quarter, as the Arabs call it, is an ideal setting for myth. It is one of the most inhospitable regions on the planet, with extreme temperatures, total absence of surface water, and dunes that can bury an entire city in a matter of weeks. In this environment, where orientation is difficult and survival precarious, the idea of a buried city does not seem so far-fetched. The desert sands are at once both tomb and guardian of the past. Today, research work at Shisar and other regions of the Arabian Desert continues using more sophisticated methods, combining ground-penetrating radar, satellite studies, and targeted excavations. The results remain ambiguous, as if the mystery itself resists being fully uncovered. Meanwhile, the legend lives on, traveling from mouth to mouth, reappearing in documentaries, books, and theories that try to reconstruct the map of a past that refuses to remain static. The story of Ubar, whether real or symbolic, remains relevant because it expresses a profound truth about the fragility of what is built, the selective memory of cultures, and the eternal tension between human pride and the forces of nature. It is a warning, yes, but also a promise that time can erase cities, but not the echoes of their names. And so, Ubar remains there, perhaps beneath the sands, perhaps only in the imagination. But what matters is that it has not disappeared. As long as there are those who seek it, as long as the desert keeps its silence and mystery, the City of Pillars will continue to be part of our deepest imagination, like a whisper among the dunes, like a ruin that pulses beneath our feet. The technique of the Mastabas. In the vast and solemn necropolis of ancient Egypt, where the shadows of the pharaohs still seem to stretch over the scorching sand, there exists an architectural form that, although often overshadowed by the grandeur of the pyramids, holds within its silent structure one of the great mysteries of Egyptian funerary thought: the Mastabas. These constructions, simple in appearance and low in profile, were the direct predecessors of the pyramids and represent a crucial stage in the architectural, ritual, and symbolic evolution of pre-dynastic Egypt and the early dynasties. Studying them is to observe the first steps of humankind toward eternity, the beginning of an obsession that would define an entire civilization. Mastabas appeared in the earliest periods of unified Egypt, around the 4th millennium before the birth of Christ, when the ancient inhabitants of the Nile began to consolidate their beliefs about death, the afterlife, and the permanence of the soul. Rectangular in shape, with flat roofs and walls slanting inward, these structures were built with sun-dried bricks, and later, in more advanced times, with stone blocks. On the outside, they might seem simple and monotonous, but inside they housed burial chambers, corridors, shafts, and rooms dedicated to rituals, offerings, and symbolic representations that turned the tomb into a replica of the known world, prepared to guarantee the continuity of existence after death. The term mastaba comes from Arabic and means stone bench, referring to its basic shape and its resemblance to adobe benches still seen in some villages of Upper Egypt. But beneath this seemingly innocent name lies a complex structure, precisely planned, aligned with the stars in the course of the Nile, and designed not only to preserve the body of the deceased, but to anchor it in time and space as a permanent entity, as a point of union between the earthly world and the realm of the gods. What is especially enigmatic is the degree of technical sophistication that mastaba builders achieved from very early times. Burial shafts dug several meters deep, primitive ventilation systems, chambers sealed with blocks weighing hundreds of kilograms, decorative paintings and reliefs. All of these point to an advanced knowledge of engineering, symbolism, and materials. The arrangement of internal rooms, the astronomical orientation of the walls, even the treatment of empty space, seemed to respond to a deeply thoughtful design where nothing was left to chance. One of the most impressive examples is found in Saqqara, the necropolis of ancient Memphis, where the Mastaba of Ti, a high official of the 5th dynasty, presents interior decoration that still amazes today for its aesthetic quality and for the level of detail it offers about daily life in ancient Egypt. Scenes of sailing, hunting, sowing, and harvesting, animals, servants, musicians, rituals, all represented with a precision and sensitivity that contradict any idea of rigidity. These images were not mere decorations. They were part of the magical ritual to preserve the soul, a way to ensure that the deceased would have access, in the afterlife, to the same pleasures, tools, and food that he enjoyed in life. But behind the art lies the mystery of the technique. How did they manage to cut, transport, and assemble stone blocks with such precision in such an early period? What tools did they use to excavate vertical shafts more than 20 meters deep with symmetry? How did they seal the burial chambers so hermetically that they have remained intact for more than 4,000 years? The answers remain elusive. Copper instruments, stone mallets, wooden rulers have been found, but these apparently rudimentary tools do not fully explain the level of perfection reached in some mastabas, especially those built of limestone or granite, materials that require very precise cutting techniques. Another fascinating question is the conceptual leap from mastabas to pyramids. This transition, which reaches its peak in the famous step pyramid of Djoser, also in Saqqara, represents a radical change, both in scale and symbolic intention. Designed by the architect Imhotep, this pyramid is nothing more than an enlarged mastaba, stacked in 6 successive levels. The simple act of raising a tomb toward the sky completely changes its meaning. It is no longer only an eternal dwelling underground, but a cosmic staircase, a visual proclamation of the bond between the pharaoh and the gods. Mastabas, therefore, were much more than tombs. They were laboratories where the ideas that would give rise to the most iconic architectural wonders of the ancient world were developed. They represented a synthesis between the functional and the symbolic, between architecture and theology. They were the starting point of a worldview that saw death not as the end, but as the beginning of another form of existence, and that demanded a material preparation for that transition as meticulous as life itself. Over time, and especially during the Old Kingdom. Mastabas became the preferred funerary form of the court elite. High officials, scribes, architects, and priests who orbited around the pharaoh. Each was a statement of status, a reflection of the place the individual had held in the state hierarchy and hoped to maintain in the afterlife. They were built in series, forming avenues of tombs aligned with geometric rigor, as if eternity itself were a careful administration where each soul had to have its assigned place. Today, when one walks among the ruins of these mastabas, many eroded by wind and time, what impresses is not their size or decoration, but their permanence. They stand there, aligned with the sun, like silent blocks containing not only mummified bodies, but the spiritual aspirations of an entire civilization. And although most have been looted or deteriorated, their presence still speaks, with the same ancient voice that echoed in the corridors when they were new. The technique of the mastabas continues to be studied by archaeologists, engineers, and Egyptologists. Each new discovery, every fragment of relief, every rediscovered shaft, adds a new piece to the puzzle of how the Egyptians understood life and death, how they designed their architecture to transcend time, and how they turned stone into an immortal language. Thus, these apparently simple structures continue to challenge our understanding, reminding us that the true mysteries are not always in the monumental, but in the subtle, in what seems humble but silently holds the pillars of eternity. The Mysteries of Eleusis. For almost 2 millennia, in a small town located about 20 kilometers from Athens, one of the most secret, sacred, and revered rites of the ancient world was celebrated. That place was called Eleusis, and its ceremonies were known as the Mysteries. Unlike official, open, and visible cults, what happened in Eleusis was covered by a veil of absolute silence. The participants swore never to reveal what they saw, heard, or felt there. And that oath, surprisingly, was respected for centuries. So much so that today, despite everything that has been written, the mysteries of Eleusis remain a living enigma, a question without a clear answer, a barely open door to the hidden. The roots of these rituals sink into the deepest origins of Greek culture. The mysteries were dedicated to Demeter, goddess of agriculture, and her daughter Persephone, deity of the underworld. Their mythology told a story of loss and reunion. Persephone was kidnapped by Hades and taken to the world of the dead. In her despair, Demeter stopped the growth of the crops, causing an eternal winter until Zeus intervened and allowed mother and daughter to reunite part of the year. This myth was not just an explanatory tale of the agricultural cycle. It was an existential drama that spoke of death, rebirth, and the promise of life beyond this one. Every year, thousands of Greeks, including philosophers, poets, kings, and ordinary people, traveled the path to Eleusis to participate in what was known as the Greater Mysteries. The initiation process began in Athens, with a series of public rituals and purifications. But the climax took place in the Telesterion, a huge underground hall where the initiates were admitted to live an experience that would change their perception of existence forever. No one could reveal what happened inside. Neither Plato, who was probably initiated, nor Cicero, nor any other great name who underwent that experience left direct testimonies. The silence was absolute, not out of fear of punishment, but because what was lived there surpassed the capacity of words. And yet, from time to time, fragments leak out. It is known that the initiates witnessed a sacred representation of the story of Demeter and Persephone, but this was not a simple theatrical dramatization. It was a ritual experience full of symbolism, music, fire, and probably substances that altered perception. Some scholars, such as the ethnobotanist Karl Ruck and the philosopher Albert Hofmann, known for synthesizing LSD, have suggested that in the ritual, a drink called kykeon was consumed, made with barley, water, and mint, but which could have contained psychoactive alkaloids derived from ergot of rye. This substance, related to the effects of lysergic acid, would have induced an expanded state of consciousness that facilitated the mystical experience. If this hypothesis is true, the mysteries of Eleusis were not only a ritual of spiritual renewal, but a true technology of the sacred, a symbolic and chemical mechanism designed to produce a transcendent vision. What was experienced there was not intellectual learning, but revelation. And those who went through that experience emerged transformed, convinced that death was not the end, that there was continuity, a connection with something vaster, deeper, and more luminous than physical existence. What is especially unsettling is the consensus among many initiates that, after participating in the mysteries, they lost their fear of death. This claim appears repeatedly, in different forms, in the few testimonies that have reached us. This suggests that the ritual, whether due to its symbolic power, emotional impact, or sensory experience induced, achieved something that institutional religions often do not: a personal, intimate, untransferable conviction of transcendence. The telesterion, with its austere architecture, was a ritual box. It did not need lavish decorations because its power lay in what it contained and in what it activated inside the initiate. Its rectangular design, with seats on the sides and columns supporting a closed roof, created a space closed off from the world, a symbolic womb in which participants died symbolically to be reborn with a new perspective. Access was forbidden to non-initiates, and it is known that even during times of war, Eleusis was respected as an inviolable space, protected by an aura of sacredness that transcended political divisions. Unlike other Greek religious practices, the mysteries of Eleusis were not exclusive. Men, women, foreigners, and even slaves could participate, as long as they spoke Greek and had not committed blood crimes. This gave the rite a deeply democratic and universal dimension, as if what was shared there belonged to the very essence of being human, without distinction of origin or social status. And yet, despite all its power and influence, the mysteries came to an end. In the 4th century of our era, the rise of Christianity and the condemnation of pagan cults by the Roman emperors led to the closure of Eleusis. The telesterion was destroyed, its priests scattered, its knowledge lost. What had been for almost 2 millennia one of the most important spiritual centers of the ancient world disappeared into silence, as if the gods themselves had withdrawn from the world. Since then, attempts have been made to reconstruct what happened in Eleusis through archaeological remains, fragments of texts, and comparative studies. But the heart of the mystery remains sealed, because the essence of the experience was not in what was said, but in what was felt. It was a language of the soul, a wisdom that is not transmitted with words or symbols, but with lived experiences. Some contemporary philosophers see in Eleusis a foreshadowing of the so-called mystery religions that would flourish in other cultures, and also of the individual mystical experiences that occur in very diverse contexts, from shamanism to deep meditation. Others have suggested that the mysteries were a form of ancient psychotherapy, a process of reintegration of the individual with their own mortality, a direct and ritualized confrontation with the ultimate truth of the human being. Be that as it may, Eleusis continues to fascinate because it represents a type of knowledge we have lost, a knowledge that is not rational, not discursive, but transformative, a knowledge that does not inform, but reveals, that does not explain, but connects. And in a modern world saturated with data and lacking deep meaning, that kind of knowledge is perhaps the most necessary. Today, among the ruins of Eleusis, one can still walk through the remains of the telesterion. The stones have lost their roof, but the ground still seems charged with that silent vibration, with that call that once attracted thousands of people to live the mystery. And although the rite is no longer celebrated, its mark remains. Because the mysteries of Eleusis, more than a specific ritual, were a way of looking at the world, a way of reconciling with death, of embracing the invisible, and of remembering, even if only for a moment, that not everything that matters can be said. The Mycenaean Civilization. On the Greek peninsula, long before the splendor of Athens, classical art, philosophical schools, and the white marble temples that defined an era, there existed an older, harsher, and more mysterious world that nonetheless left an indelible mark on the memory of Western civilization. This was the Mycenaean Civilization, a powerful kingdom that emerged between the 16th and 12th centuries before the birth of Christ, dominating not only the Greek mainland, but also extending its influence across the Aegean Sea, reaching Cyprus, Anatolia, and possibly even further. It was the civilization of Homeric heroes, the backdrop of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and at the same time, a deeply real and tangible culture that built fortresses, buried its kings in cone-shaped stone tombs, and left inscriptions that, centuries later, still question us from hardened clay. The rediscovery of Mycenae began at the end of the 19th century when Heinrich Schliemann, the same adventurer and self-taught archaeologist who had excavated Troy believing in the literal truth of Homer, became obsessed with finding Agamemnon's tomb. Excavating the hill of Mycenae, he uncovered a fortified palace complex, cyclopean walls made of enormous stone blocks, and a set of shaft graves and tholos tombs, or beehive-shaped chamber tombs, where he found gold masks, weapons, jewelry, and human remains that, with overflowing enthusiasm, he declared to be those of the Achaean kings described in the epic poems. Although this literal identification was later questioned, the discovery was crucial. Schliemann had opened the door to a world until then buried. What later excavations revealed was a highly hierarchical, warrior-like culture, governed by kings who lived in fortified palaces and controlled a highly organized network of production, storage, and distribution. The main centers of this civilization were Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and Orchomenus, all strategically located to control trade and defensive routes. Their palaces, although less refined than those of the Minoan civilization of Crete, featured a centralized structure around the megaron, a large throne room with a central hearth, and were decorated with frescoes combining military, religious, and natural motifs. Mycenaean writing, known as Linear B, was deciphered in the 1950s by Michael Ventris, who demonstrated that it was an early form of Greek. This revelation radically changed our understanding of the Mycenaean world. It was no longer an unknown predecessor, but a direct part of the cultural lineage that would lead to classical Greece. The texts found, mostly administrative records, tribute lists, and inventories of goods, reveal a bureaucratic society with a centralized economy and a religiosity that included deities who would later be prominent on Olympus, such as Poseidon, Zeus, or Hera, though with still primitive characteristics associated with fertility, war, and nature. What is fascinating about this civilization is the contrast between the idealized image passed down through Homer, with its noble heroes, their deeds, and code of honor, and the reality shown by archaeological sources, a culture marked by violence, by the palace's iron control over production, by wealthy tombs beside humble houses, by weapons alongside religious symbols. It is as if the heroic song had softened the edges of a rough and tense world, full of power and the fear of losing it. And yet, that same civilization that dominated the Aegean for centuries extended its trade network to Egypt and Mesopotamia, absorbed Minoan influences, and transformed them into a harsher, more functional expression, disappeared suddenly and mysteriously around the year 1200 before the birth of Christ. The Mycenaean collapse is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Within barely 50 years, the palaces were abandoned, inscriptions ceased, trade routes were disrupted, and the population seemed to retreat to simpler rural lifestyles, stripped of former sophistication. The causes of this collapse have been the subject of intense debate. Some point to a combination of internal and external factors: social rebellions against the palace order, climate changes affecting agriculture, earthquakes, and especially pressure from the so-called Sea Peoples, invaders who would have ravaged the region from the eastern Mediterranean, Others argue that it was not a sudden catastrophe but a gradual disintegration of the Mycenaean system, unable to sustain its complex organization in an increasingly hostile environment. What is certain is that after the fall of the Mycenaean palaces, Greece entered a period historians call the Dark Ages, a stage in which artistic production drastically decreased, writing disappeared, and many cultural and commercial connections with the outside world were lost. It is as if a great civilization had been swallowed by the night, leaving behind only ruined walls, looted tombs, and an oral literature that centuries later would be transformed into epic poetry. And yet, from that darkness emerged the light. The political and social structures of the Mycenaean world served as the foundation for the Greek polis. The memory of its heroes fueled the rhapsodes' songs. Its architectural techniques, sense of order, and religious pantheon all remained latent, waiting for the moment to re-emerge. The Mycenae of Agamemnon, real or not, remained alive in the imagination of the Greeks, and what Homer wrote was not simply fantasy, but an echo of a civilization that, though fallen, continued to vibrate beneath the words. Today, visiting the ruins of Mycenae or Tiryns is to confront a past both near and distant. The Cyclopean walls, with blocks so large that tradition said only the Cyclopes could have built them, still stand. The Lion Gate, the underground corridors, the royal tombs, all speak of a power that refused to go unnoticed. And yet, the silence reigning in these places is profound, almost absolute, as if history refuses to fully reveal its secrets. The Mycenaean civilization reminds us that history is not linear, that cultures can flourish and vanish, that knowledge and beauty can be lost, and that even the most powerful can fall. But it also shows us that there is memory in stone, in word, and in symbol. That even after collapse, something survives, something waits. And perhaps that is the true mystery of Mycenae, that without having left its own voice, without philosophical texts, treaties, or speeches, it still speaks to us, with its walls, with its tombs, with its absences. Because in history, as in myths, sometimes what is left unsaid is what endures the most. The unfinished obelisk of Aswan. At the southernmost tip of ancient Egypt, where the Nile River flows with solemn majesty between granite banks and hills, bathed in the unchanging light of the desert, lies one of the most silent yet striking enigmas of pharaonic architecture. It is the unfinished obelisk of Aswan, a massive stone resting on its side, as if time had caught it in the middle of a monumental act, as if the workers had vanished while still at work, leaving behind an open scar in the quarry and a question suspended in the air. Why was it never finished? What really happened to this colossal work, perhaps destined to be the largest obelisk in all of Egyptian history? The Aswan quarry, from which this gigantic block of pink granite comes, was one of the main stone extraction centers of ancient Egypt. From here came materials that shaped temples, statues, sarcophagi, and above all, obelisks. Those vertical monuments, carved from a single piece, erected in sacred courtyards to symbolically capture the sunlight and connect the earthly world with the celestial order. Raising an obelisk was a technical, political, and spiritual feat. It required coordination of human resources, a mathematical understanding of balance and the center of gravity, and a will to project power in terms only eternity could understand. In that context, the unfinished obelisk of Aswan stands as a majestic anomaly. With its more than 41 meters in length and its estimated 1,200 tons of weight, it would have surpassed all known obelisks by several times if it had been completed and erected. But it remains lying down, still attached to the bedrock from which it was carved, trapped in the quarry floor like a colossus half awakened. It is, in a sense, a failed work. And yet, its presence is overwhelming because it allows us to glimpse the process. the moment frozen in which human effort and material confront each other directly, without intermediaries or disguises. The most accepted theories maintain that the obelisk was abandoned due to the appearance of a crack in its structure. The quarry workers, upon detecting a fracture in the granite that compromised the stability of the monolith, decided to halt work and leave it there, irretrievable. But even that practical explanation does not diminish the mystery of the fact itself. What impresses is not only its size but the way it was carved. The ancient Egyptians did not have iron tools, much less steel. What they used were dolerite balls, a rock harder than granite itself, with which they tirelessly struck the stone surface to open grooves, dig channels, and shape straight forms with a precision that, at first glance, seems incompatible with the repetitive hammering technique. The unfinished obelisk reveals those marks. The walls surrounding it are marked by regular depressions, made patiently and forcefully by those who worked under extreme conditions of heat, dust, and danger. There is no doubt the process was arduous but also deeply methodical. Workers dug trenches around the block to isolate it from the rest of the rock, leaving a narrow bed of stone underneath. When the monolith was practically freed, wooden wedges and levers, moistened to expand, were used to cause a controlled fracture and separate the obelisk completely. In this case, the process stopped before reaching that final stage. And there it lies, like a physical document of the attempt, like an unfinished page in the book of stone. What is most fascinating is that, despite its incompletion, the Aswan obelisk has been a source of inspiration for all kinds of theories, some rigorous and others more speculative. Some see in its size and the techniques used an indication that the ancient Egyptians possessed technological knowledge we still do not fully understand. The precision of the lines, the symmetry of the block, the choice of material, everything has been scrutinized with a magnifying glass. Some propose that the carving was done with methods more advanced than official history admits. There are those who speak of unknown metal tools, acoustic techniques, thermal manipulation, or even external intervention. But beyond the extraordinary hypotheses, the truth is that, even with known means, the achievement is impressive. The obelisk was not simply a monumental ornament. Its meaning was charged with deep symbolism. It represented the petrified ray of the god Ra, the vertical connection between man and the divine, the unity between heaven and earth. Erecting an obelisk was establishing a cosmic axis, fixing a point in the landscape from which harmony and power emanate. That is why they were placed in pairs in front of temples, flanking the portals, as if guarding the threshold between the human and the eternal. That this particular obelisk did not reach its destiny adds a tragic and solemn nuance to its story. It is a symbol that never rose, a promise halted. Today, the place where the unfinished obelisk rests is an archaeological site visited by thousands of people every year. The open-air quarry allows visitors to walk among the grooves, touch the stone, and feel the heat accumulated over millennia. There are no temples or columns, only rock and silence. Yet few structures manage to convey so powerfully the dimension of human effort, technical ambition, and the fragility of plans when confronted with the unexpected. What remains in the end is the form of the uncompleted, because in its incomplete state, the obelisk of Aswan perhaps speaks to us more eloquently than if it had been finished and raised. It reminds us that every human work is a dialogue with matter, with its limits and possibilities, and that even the most advanced civilizations faced failures, accidents, and renunciations. But it also speaks to the impulse to create something lasting, to inscribe a will in stone, to look toward the sky from the solidity of the ground. In the history of Egypt, there are great achievements, temples that defy time, pyramids still standing after millennia. But this unfinished obelisk, lying in its granite cradle, holds a different strength. It is not a triumph, but a vestige of the attempt. And perhaps for that reason, it has become a powerful symbol of what human beings can conceive, even when they do not reach it. Thule Island. At the borders of ancient knowledge, beyond the precisely drawn maps and the routes sailed by merchants and conquerors, there exists a place that has fueled the imagination of philosophers, geographers, poets, and mystics for more than 2,000 years. A point on the horizon of understanding that neither fully belongs to reality nor completely fades into fiction. A territory shrouded in perpetual mist, at the edge of the known world, called Thule by the Greeks, and which since then has remained a symbol of the inaccessible, the remote, the mysterious. The first author to mention Thule is Pytheas of Massalia, a Greek explorer from the 4th century before the birth of Christ, whose journey to the northern lands, from the Mediterranean to the coasts of the North Atlantic, represents one of the most fascinating and most debated episodes in ancient history. Pytheas, sailing from the port city of Massalia, present-day Marseille, traveled through the British Isles, crossed the northern seas, and arrived, according to his own testimony, at a place located 6 days' sail from the Hebrides, where the sun barely set during the summer, and where the sea turned into a viscous substance, like mud or melted ice. That place was called Thule, and from that moment, it began to exist in the European imagination as a last land, beyond which there was nothing known. Later references, both Roman and medieval, turned Thule into a kind of symbolic frontier between the ordered world and the unknown, between the clarity of knowledge and the shadow of the unknowable. Virgil mentions it as the boundary of the empire. Seneca cites it as the limit of navigation. Pliny the Elder includes it in his geographical descriptions, though with skepticism. Yet none of these sources managed to pinpoint its location with certainty, as if Thule actively resisted being fixed on the map. For centuries, scholars tried to solve the enigma. Some identified Thule with Iceland, due to its geographical characteristics and the description of the thick sea that Pytheas observed, probably a phenomenon associated with floating ice fields. Others proposed Norway, or even northern Scotland, noting that for ancient Mediterranean navigators, any land beyond Britain would have seemed remote and misty. It has also been suggested that Thule could correspond to the Faroe Islands, or to a symbolic region located beyond the Arctic Circle, where day and night blur and the seasons lose their usual rhythm. But beyond geography, Thule began to transform into an idea. Over time, it ceased to be a concrete place and became a figure of thought, an emblem of the distant and unattainable. During the Renaissance, some humanists revived its myth to speak of the limits of human knowledge. For others, it was a Hyperborean land, inhabited by sages and guardians of ancestral wisdom beyond the reach of the civilized world. Even Nazism, in its twisted reinterpretation of the Aryan myth, turned Thule into the mythical cradle of a supposed primordial civilization, inspiring the creation of the so-called Thule Society, an esoteric organization that fueled theories of racial superiority and contact with beyond-human races. The use and abuse of the image of Thule throughout history is revealing. Each era projected onto it its own aspirations and fears, its limits, and its desire to overcome them. As if Thule, lacking a precise location, became a screen upon which each culture draws its idea of the unknown. For the ancients, it was the frontier of the physical world. For the Romantics, a symbol of the sublime, what the soul longs for but cannot reach. For occultists, the place of origin of lost knowledge. For modern explorers, a possible point of contact between history, geography, and myth. The mystery intensified with the advent of scientific cartography. As the world was mapped with increasing precision, Thule began to recede, like a mirage that moves away the closer one pursues it. On 16th century maps, it appears as part of the northern archipelago, although without alignment with real coordinates. At other times, it is located north of Iceland, or even in Greenland. Its existence, however, was never definitively confirmed, and that is what makes it endure. because if Thule had been found and catalogued, it would have lost its power. Its strength lies precisely in what it suggests, not in what it offers. And there is another, even deeper aspect that deserves to be explored: the initiatory nature of Thule. In some esoteric currents, Thule represents the starting point of the inner journey, a land of the spirit that can only be reached through personal transformation. It is the place where the ordinary world dissolves and the other begins, the sacred, the hidden. To reach Thule in this sense is not a nautical voyage but a process of revelation. It is not reached by coordinates, but through states of consciousness. It is the threshold between the visible and the invisible, the known and the intuited. And at this point, the story of Pythias acquires a particular resonance, because what he described was not only a physical territory, but a limit experience. The sea that is no longer sea, the day that is no longer day, the cold that defies known laws. Pythias was the first known European to confront the Arctic, not just as a geographic space, but as a metaphysical frontier. And that makes him a figure of transition between the ancient world that wanted to measure everything and the mystery that resists all measurement. Today, the word Thule continues to appear in various contexts. A region on the planet has been named after it in pop mythology, a research station in Greenland, and even a trans-Neptunian object discovered by NASA and renamed Arakoth. Each of these contemporary uses demonstrates that Thule still resonates as a concept. Its legacy is not only archaeological, philological, or historical, but symbolic. Because what cannot be located, what cannot be fully grasped, what remains on the edge of comprehension, has a more enduring life than any precise coordinate. And perhaps that is why we continue to speak of Thule. Because in a world where everything seems to be within the reach of a satellite, a camera, or a drone, there is something comforting in knowing that there are still places that can only be reached through mystery, imagination, and the desire to go beyond. Thule is there, on the margins of ancient maps, in the uncharted lines of the human soul. In that place where history meets myth and both merge into something that transcends them both. No matter how many times it is sought without being found, Thule lives as long as there are those who keep walking toward the unknown. The Rongo Rongo script of Easter Island. In the midst of the vast and silent Pacific Ocean, thousands of kilometers from any continental coast, rises an island as remote as it is enigmatic. Easter Island, known as Rapa Nui by its original inhabitants, has been for centuries a place of fascination, not only because of its imposing moais, those colossal statues that watch the horizon like stone sentinels, but also because of an even deeper mystery, harder to decipher than the carved expressions on their faces. This is the Rongo Rongo, a writing system that remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. Discovered by Europeans in the 17th century, Easter Island already offered at that time the sensation of a closed world, a civilization that had lived a complete cycle of rise and collapse without significant contact with the outside for centuries. But it was not until the 19th century that Western missionaries and explorers came across tablets engraved with strange symbols, stylized drawings of human figures, animals, objects, and geometric shapes arranged in a very peculiar way, written in lines going from left to right and then from right to left on the next line, in a kind of zigzag known as reverse boustrophodon, as if the figures themselves turned over when changing lines, creating a visual dance as hypnotic as it was puzzling. This system of signs, named by the Rapa Nui themselves as Rongo Rongo, has resisted all attempts at decipherment ever since. Unlike other ancient scripts, such as Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, Rongo Rongo lacks bilingual texts, lacks regional variants, and above all, lacks a functional context that would allow useful comparisons. The tablets that have survived, no more than 24, scattered among museums in Europe and America, do not show numbers, dates, or clear references to astronomical phenomena or verifiable historical events. They are, in essence, a mute gallery, a succession of signs that repeat patterns without us knowing for sure whether we are facing a phonetic script, an ideographic system, a ritual code, or ceremonial art that only made sense within a spiritual context lost forever. Most of the tablets were carved from the wood of the Toromiro tree, a resource increasingly scarce on the island at the time of their discovery. Many of them show repetitive signs, carefully carved symmetries, and a precision that contradicts the idea of an improvised or informal script. Most likely, it was knowledge transmitted orally from generation to generation, and its use was restricted to a religious or priestly elite, possibly linked to the Ariki, the tribal chiefs, or to the wise men who kept alive the Rapa Nui cosmogony. One of the most puzzling aspects of Rongo Rongo is its origin. Some researchers propose that the inhabitants of Rapa Nui developed this system autonomously, which would make it one of the few independent writing systems created by humans, alongside the Mesopotamian, Chinese, and Mayan scripts. However, this hypothesis challenges historical conventions, since the creation of a writing system without known previous models, and in such an isolated environment seems highly unlikely according to usual patterns of cultural evolution. Other theorists suggest that Rongo Rongo could have arisen after contact with Europeans, as a kind of ritual reaction, a symbolic adaptation of external forms reinterpreted with original content. But this explanation also does not fully fit, given that the signs show a degree of systematization and antiquity that suggests much deeper roots. Throughout the 20th century, multiple attempts have been made to translate or at least classify the script. Father Sebastian Englert, one of the first to systematize Rapa Nui oral tradition, collected testimonies from the last elders who claimed to have seen their ancestors read the tablets, although without being able to replicate the content. Thomas Barthel, one of the most outstanding epigraphers of the last century, created an inventory of signs, identifying more than 600 different glyphs and their variants, but he did not manage to establish a clear correspondence with any known language. Other researchers have pointed out that some tablets could contain calendrical records or genealogical lists. It has even been proposed that Rongo Rongo might have a dual structure, a script that alternated phonetic information with symbolic or ritual meanings in a code so dense that its logic is lost if one does not simultaneously understand the language, worldview, and ceremonial context. That is to say, the writing not only encoded words but sacred concepts, mythical visions, links to ancestors and gods. In this sense, its decipherment could be impossible without reviving a way of understanding the world that has already disappeared. The final blow to understanding Rongo Rongo came with the cultural collapse of Rapa Nui. Slavery, diseases introduced by Europeans, forced conversion to Christianity, and the destruction of traditional icons caused a radical break in the chain of knowledge transmission. By the late 19th century, there were no longer people on the island capable of reading the tablets, and many were burned or used as firewood. Those that survived did so almost by chance, collected by missionaries or traders who did not always understand their value. Thus, what could have been a fundamental key to understanding the Rapa Nui worldview became a scattered collection of objects, removed from their context and transformed into museum enigmas. Today, Rongo Rongo remains one of the few ancient writing systems still undeciphered. Its mystery is even more powerful because it lies at the heart of an island culture that, despite its extreme isolation, managed to build colossal monuments, develop its own astronomical system, and sustain for centuries a social organization surprising for its geographic size. All this points to a sophistication that does not fit the stereotypes of primitivism that long shaped the Western view of Pacific peoples. But the enigma of Rongo Rongo does not reside solely in its illegibility. It is also in what it represents: a lost story, a voice that tried to speak and was silenced, a language frozen in stone or wood that no one can now repeat. Perhaps someday an unexpected archaeological find, a tablet with a parallel text, a forgotten codex, a ceremonial chant that survives in a recording, will open a crack in this wall of incomprehension? Perhaps not. Perhaps, like so many other languages of the past, Rongo Rongo is destined to remain closed, like a sacred chest without a key. But even so, its power remains. Because it reminds us that words are not just tools of communication, but ways to create worlds. That writing is not just recording, but invoking. And that sometimes, the act of carving symbols into wood is, in itself, a form of eternity. The menhirs of Carnac in France. In the heart of French Brittany, where Atlantic winds caress the green fields and villages seem frozen in their own time, lies one of the most baffling archaeological landscapes of the ancient world. This is the Carnac alignment, a collection of more than 3,000 vertically erected stones, the famous menhirs, standing like a mineral procession across the land, forming lines, rows, clusters, and solitary granite sentinels that defy modern understanding. There, in that corner of northwestern Europe, prehistoric humans left a mark that still raises questions, provokes theories, and awakens a profound mix of awe, respect, and unease. The Carnac complex, with multiple sites spread over more than 4 kilometers, constitutes one of the most impressive examples of megalithism in all of Europe. It is estimated to date back to the Neolithic period, approximately between 4,500 and 3,000 years before the birth of Christ, making it a testimony to societies that did not yet know writing or metal, yet were capable of moving, carving, and aligning stone blocks, weighing several tons with a precision and sense of space that remains enigmatic. The most famous alignments, such as Menek, Kermario, and Kerleskan, present rows of menhirs arranged with a regularity that seems to follow a pre-established order, as if they were a stone script whose meaning has been lost over the centuries. The first written descriptions of Carnac appear in the Middle Ages, when local scholars and clerics, lacking archaeological or scientific references, began to interpret these stones as the work of druids, or even as petrified columns of ancient cursed armies. Popular imagination turned the menhirs into Roman soldiers turned to stone by divine power, an image reflecting the impression these vertical blocks caused in those who encountered them without explanation. But as archaeological knowledge advanced, it became clear that these structures were much older than any Celtic or Roman reference, and that their purpose must be sought in the beliefs, rites, and astronomical knowledge of Neolithic societies. One of Carnac's great enigmas is the purpose of its alignments. Unlike other megalithic sites where menhirs appear isolated or in circles, at Carnac, the arrangement in parallel rows suggests large-scale planning, a stony choreography that does not seem random. Some theories propose it was an astronomical observatory, where the stones marked key events in the solar or lunar calendar, such as solstices, equinoxes, or moon phases. Other proposals point to a ritual or funerary function, in which the menhirs represented symbolic paths between the world of the living and that of the dead, or even channels of spiritual energy that ordered the landscape according to geomantic principles. The fact is that the effort required to erect such a structure, without pack animals, pulleys, or metal tools, demands thinking about a very organized society, with a clear hierarchy, a ruling class capable of mobilizing hundreds of people for long periods of time, and, above all, with a worldview powerful enough to justify such titanic labor. Because each stone had to be extracted, transported several kilometers, placed upright with precision, and aligned according to coordinates that still spark debates among archaeologists, astronomers, and anthropologists. The symbolic dimension of the menhir is essential. These stones, unlike those composing dolmens or burial mounds, stand upright. They rise. They point to the sky. They become a kind of vertical needle that breaks the horizon, as if trying to establish a connection between the earth and the heavens. In many archaic cultures, the upright stone symbolizes permanence, fertility, cosmic stability. Its verticality encloses a fundamental gesture, resisting the passage of time, fixing a point in space, turning the ground into a sacred place. And in Karnak, that gesture repeats thousands of times. Some stones measure more than 7 meters tall and weigh over 20 tons. Others, smaller, cluster at the ends of alignments or in concentric circles. The variety of shapes and sizes, far from random, seems to obey an intentional pattern, although we have not yet deciphered it. Some believe the menhirs were part of a gigantic system for measuring time, a kind of three-dimensional calendar that allowed following the course of the stars and regulating agricultural seasons. Others suggest the stones marked places of power, energy intersection points in the landscape, and that their arrangement was the result of a spiritual sensitivity perceiving invisible forces in the earth. Hypotheses abound. Some researchers have compared the Karnak alignments with other large megalithic complexes, such as Stonehenge or the Callanish circles in Scotland, searching for common patterns indicating a shared cultural tradition among prehistoric peoples from different regions. Others have tried applying mathematical models, searching for golden ratios, numerical sequences, or hidden geometric relationships among the stones. And some, from a more symbolic perspective, propose that Karnak was a pilgrimage center, a place where rites of passage, initiation ceremonies, or seasonal meetings between tribes were celebrated. Despite centuries of research, what remains is mystery. The stones stand there, silent but imposing, as if wanting to say something beyond our grasp. And that silence is perhaps their greatest power. Because in a world saturated with explanations, finding a human work not yet fully understood forces us to stop, listen differently, and consider that ancient knowledge may have operated in dimensions we have forgotten. Karnak reminds us that there was a time when man spoke to the earth, not only with words but with gestures of stone, with alignments that were prayers, with structures that were simultaneously map, rite, and message. Today, the site is protected but also divided by fences, roads, and urban developments that have altered its original unity. Many stones were removed, destroyed, or reused in medieval constructions, and others have fallen over time. Still, what remains is enough to move the sensitive visitor. Just walking among the rows of menhirs, feeling the crunch of grass underfoot, and watching how the evening light caresses their rough surfaces, is enough to understand that we are facing more than an archaeological complex. We are facing an act of profound communication between past and present, between human beings and the cosmos. Karnak has no easy answers, and perhaps for that very reason it remains so powerful. Because in its stones lives the possibility of wonder, that emotion that connects us with the sacred, the ancient, and the immense. The Enigma of Tartessos. At the edges of the known ancient world, where the Mediterranean begins to blur into the Atlantic Ocean and the waters are tinged with the mystery evoked by the idea of the unexplored, the ancient Greeks placed a wondrous land, rich in metals, abundant in resources, and marked by a sophistication that surprised even those accustomed to the grandeur of Egypt or Babylon. That land was called Tartessos, and since it was mentioned by Herodotus, Anacreon, Strabo, and other classical chroniclers, it has become one of the most persistent historical enigmas of the Iberian Peninsula. Because Tartessos was for a time a real and powerful civilization, and yet, at some indeterminate moment, it vanished without a clear trace, as if it had been absorbed by the earth, by time, or by oblivion. Located in the southwest of present-day Spain, probably between the marshes of the Guadalquivir River and the coast of the Gulf of Cadiz, Tartessos appears in ancient sources as a city-state, or perhaps a group of cities, organized around a kingdom that amazed by its wealth and refinement. Herodotus, in the 5th century before the birth of Christ, speaks of Argantonio, the king of Tartessos, describing him as a wise, hospitable, and long-lived monarch who offered asylum to the Phocian Greeks in an unusual gesture of openness for the time. That brief account sparked fascination for a culture that seemed to combine features of Eastern civilizations, but with its own identity, shrouded in the mist of the distant past. The main reason for the interest Tartessos aroused among the peoples of the Mediterranean was its abundance of metals, particularly gold, silver, and tin, essential elements for bronze production. The Tartessians, as their inhabitants were called, exploited the veins of the Sierra Morena and the mines of Huelva, controlling trade routes that connected the interior of the peninsula with the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts. It has been suggested that they maintained exchanges with the Phoenicians from at least the 9th century before Christ, and from this interaction arose hybrid forms of art, writing, and religion that enriched Tartessian culture and gave it a unique character. Yet the greatness of Tartessos was not enough to guarantee its permanence. Between the 6th and 5th centuries before Christ, the Tartessian civilization disappears from the records with baffling speed. Greek sources cease to mention it. Trade routes changed hands. Tartessian urban centers like the mysterious Cerro del Carambolo near Seville stopped showing signs of occupation. Wealth faded, artistic forms transformed, and what was once a flourishing culture dissolved into others, perhaps absorbed by new ethnic groups or invasions coming from the interior. This sudden collapse has been the subject of multiple hypotheses. Some historians point to a natural decline of the economic system, resource depletion, or disruption of tin routes. Others suggest conflict with the Phoenicians or with peoples from the north, such as the Celts, who might have begun pressing into the southwestern peninsula during that era. A major natural catastrophe has also been proposed, such as a massive flood caused by changes in the Guadalquivir River's course that would have inundated coastal cities, forcing their abandonment. In this regard, many have wanted to see Tartessos as a sort of Iberian Atlantis, a lost civilization whose ruins lie beneath the waters, waiting to be rediscovered. The parallel with Atlantis is not accidental. Some researchers have gone further, proposing the possibility that the accounts of Tartessos were among the sources Plato drew on to construct his myth of the sunken island. Both civilizations are described as rich, sophisticated, ahead of their time, and then erased by a sudden event. However, in Tartessos' case, there is concrete archaeological evidence that supports considering it a historical reality, though still poorly understood. Among the most notable findings are the remains of the Carambolo treasure, discovered in 1958. This set of solid gold jewelry and adornments, with exquisite craftsmanship and an aesthetic that mixes local elements with Eastern influences, has been interpreted as part of a ritual burial linked to a sanctuary or the ruling elite. Its discovery rekindled interest in Tartessos and sparked new excavations in the region, although without conclusive results to precisely locate its capital or fully understand the nature of its political and social system. Other sites, such as Canchoroano in Badajoz, feature monumental structures that have been linked to Tartessian culture, though without unanimous consensus. The difficulty lies in the fact that Tartessos seems to have been a bridge civilization, a transitional one that absorbed multiple influences and, in turn, was the cradle of cultural processes that later unfolded in the Iberian world. Its language, still undeciphered, appears in fragmentary inscriptions that do not allow reconstruction of a complete system, and its mythology has been almost entirely lost, leaving only scattered echoes in the later stories of the peoples who replaced it. Today, Tartessos remains an archaeological promise, a word that resonates strongly in laboratories, museums, excavations, and the texts of those who still believe that beneath the surface of the Andalusian marshes lies the key to understanding an essential and forgotten chapter of European history. Because if we could reconstruct its political structure, its art, its writing, we could fill one of the largest gaps in Western proto-history. And yet, its true mystery perhaps does not lie so much in what it was, but in how it was forgotten. In how a culture that had managed to enter the radar of classical peoples that traded with Phoenicians and was mentioned by the Greeks with admiration, disappeared so cleanly from the narrative as if erased with care. That form of disappearance, almost elegant, almost deliberate, gives Tartessos an aura that exceeds the archaeological and touches the mythical. Today, walking through the lowlands of Huelva or Cádiz, where the river widens and the land blends with the salt, one can look to the horizon and wonder if beneath that apparent normality still lie the remains of a civilization that knew how to shine with its own light, and that decided, or was forced, to give way to time. Tartessos, though veiled, remains alive in its enigma, and as long as we cannot clearly hear its buried voice, it will remain one of those places that, like the greatest mysteries, exist more for their absence than for their presence, more for what they hint at than for what they reveal. The mysteries of antiquity remain, waiting for someone to listen, for someone to dare to imagine what we may never know for sure. And now that you have traveled through these stories, this journey does not end here. Leave me your opinion in the comments. Which of these mysteries has kept you awake? Which do you think we will someday solve? Or perhaps, which would you prefer to remain intact, kept in the shadow of oblivion? Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the most hidden corners of our past. And remember, some secrets do not seek explanation, only someone to listen.